is available now, covering tons of crazy and interesting content. I hope you enjoy.
I was 8 years old when we first moved into the house on the edge of the forest. My parents had their doubts about buying a house with a backyard bordered by forest. They had concerns about the wild animals getting into our bins or hurting our dogs, and were worried one of us might go too far into the trees and get lost. But it was cheap. My dad liked the seclusion. My mom loved the house itself, and my siblings and I were excited about playing in the backyard and exploring the forest. Our first sign that something wasn't right was that our dogs were absolutely terrified of the forest. They never went into the forest for any reason. If a toy they'd been playing with found its way past the tree line, they would refuse to retrieve it, and when one of us went in, they would pace anxiously until we returned. On occasion, we'd notice the dogs staring at a spot in the forest in obvious distress, sometimes growling or barking, but we could never see anything there. My brother once carried one of the dogs into the trees to show her there was nothing scary about it, but she wriggled out of his grip and sprinted into the house in a panic. If we were in the backyard when it was getting dark, we sometimes heard noises like someone walking through the forest, sticks crunching underfoot, branches being pushed aside. If we called out, there was no response. But if we shined a flashlight around, we would occasionally catch a glimpse for just a split second of something that we could swear looked like a person walking around in the dark. My parents quickly banned us from entering the forest at all after dark, and even during the day we weren't allowed to go out of sight of the house. My sister's bedroom window looked out to the backyard and the forest beyond, and she remembers looking out her window one night and seeing a shadowy figure standing right at the edge of the backyard. She said there was something wrong with it, like it wasn't quite standing on the ground, and it was a little too tall to be a person and was sort of distorted. And she was convinced it was staring directly at her. She called for our dad, saying that there was a man in the yard staring through her window, and when he ran outside to chase off whoever it was, she continued to watch the figure. It didn't move away, but when the light from our dad's flashlight passed over it, it suddenly just wasn't there anymore. We regularly heard knocking at the back door at night, with no one there. Our parents thought it was teenagers playing pranks, and stopped bothering even opening the door until one rainy night when the knocking was persistent and agitated. My mom pointed out there might be someone needing shelter from the heavy rain outside, but when she opened the door, not only was there no one there, but there were no wet footprints on the porch. The knocking continued the whole time we lived there. It would happen several times in the span of a few weeks, then stop for months, then start up again. My parents eventually installed a security camera, and there was never anyone at the door. The camera wasn't all useless, though. About 3 years into living there, my brother started having night terrors and sleepwalking. When he went sleepwalking, he would always go out the back door and start walking towards the forest. My mom, being a light sleeper, would hear the door open and would run out to get him before he made it into the forest. After the third or fourth time it happened, my brother asked to see the camera footage because he wanted to see how he looked when sleepwalking, I guess thinking it'd look funny. The footage showed him walking out onto the porch, then pausing as if listening to something and shaking his head, then reluctantly walking forward as if being pulled or forcefully guided by something. One evening, my dad was in the backyard and he heard my sister calling him from the forest, seemingly in distress. Thinking she'd gone exploring in the forest and fallen over and hurt herself, he ran in and started calling to her, but quickly realized it was too dark to see her and he couldn't pinpoint where her voice was coming from. He told her to wait where she was while he grabbed a flashlight. When he ran back inside the house for the flashlight, he saw my sister inside, safe and completely unconcerned. At the time, my dad hadn't told us about hearing my sister's voice in the forest, so when I heard my mom's voice coming from the forest months later while I was outside with the dogs one evening, I didn't question it, despite the fact that I'd seen my mom inside recently and hadn't noticed her walking past me. My mom was calling to me, saying she got in her sweater caught in some branches and needed me to come in and help her. As I walked in, the dog started barking, alerting my dad, who saw me through the windows wandering into the forest. He came outside and called to me, and I said I was just helping Mom. He yelled back that Mom was inside and I needed to run back to the house as fast as I could, which I did. After this, my parents had a fence built around the backyard and started looking for a new place. In the time between the fence being built and us moving out, it got way worse. We'd hear knocking at the door more regularly, as well as tapping on the windows as if someone was walking the perimeter of the house and trying every window. We would often hear scratching and scraping sounds on the fence and voices beyond it. My brother's night terrors got more frequent, and one night my mom didn't hear the door open when he went sleepwalking, and he woke up standing at the fence, staring into the forest with the dogs barking at him. The last morning we spent there, less than 4 years after we moved in, we woke up to find the back door fully open, and the security camera footage showed it slowly swing open on its own. Since moving out, my brother's sleepwalking has stopped, though he still gets night terrors and he suffers from pretty severe anxiety. A few nights ago, he called me out of the blue, and after a bit of small talk, he asked me if I think the door being open that final night means whatever was out there finally got in. He was trying to make light of it, saying he was getting into the spirit of Halloween, joking about how maybe we should all get exercise just in case something latched onto us all those years ago. But I think he's deeply bothered by everything that happened. I know I still am a little. I still get nervous around dark wooded areas. I don't know what I think was out there, in the forest behind our house at night, but I get the feeling that, given the chance, it would have swallowed us whole. I was 14 years old, I went to a church gathering on a Halloween night that was called Hallelujah Night, a Christian alternative to Halloween. My family and I would get there in the afternoon since we'd volunteer to help set up the booths, cakewalk, candy barrels, etc. But I was mostly there to get first dibs on all the candy. After I finished helping with the usual booth I helped set up, I took a seat on a bench near the main sanctuary. It was my favorite place to sit at since I could see the entire lot and most of all the beautiful sunset. I pulled out my PSP and was scrolling through some music I had on it when some guy approached me and started a conversation. I've never been a people person, so usually when things like this happen, I keep the conversation short. However, this guy had this weird type of warmth to him, as if he was a friend of mine. As the conversation carried on, I started to ask him if he was new because I hadn't seen him before. He told me that he had been going to this church for years, but left after an incident happened. When I asked him about the incident, he paused, looked at me and said that there's some things people pick up on that they know aren't normal. Also, that you should never get curious about things that you know you should leave alone. I had a sort of confused look on my face since I didn't know what he meant at that time. The guy noticed it and said that I would understand once I got older. I looked down at my PSP that I had in my hand still and looked back up, and the guy was gone. I looked around and couldn't find him anywhere in the lot except for a few people still prepping for Hallelujah Night. It didn't make any sense. Fast forward to a few months later, I was sitting in the main sanctuary before leaving to do my usual volunteer work on the upper floor of the main sanctuary. The upper floor was a daycare area for kids. So at the end of the service, volunteers would escort the children downstairs, and I would go into each room shutting off the lights and making sure no children were still up there.
defeat.
I'll never forget getting to leave to do my usual duties when the pastor started talking about an upcoming funeral. I look at the big screens on each side of the main sanctuary, and the face of that of the man I was talking to during Hallelujah night was there. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. To this day, it still seems unreal. I was beyond shook as I made my way out of the main sanctuary into the flights of big stairs as I went to the upper floor. Once I made it up to the upper floor, another volunteer had confirmed that all the children were escorted downstairs. She noticed that I had looked sort of pale from seeing what I saw in the main sanctuary and asked me if I was okay. I told her it was nothing and proceeded to cut off all of the lights on the upper floor as she left downstairs. The upper floor was like a giant hallway with doors on each side and a door at the end of the hallway with a giant window in it. When I came to the last room at the end of the hall, I would always leave the blinds on that big window open since the light always illuminated the dark hallway and made me feel less scared. But as I left the room, I remember feeling panicked. It started freezing, and I felt like if I left that room, something was waiting for me in the darkened rooms that was going to jump out and attack me. As I'm trying to muster up the courage to just run for it, I see a small head of a child peek out a couple of doors down. It stayed there for a few seconds and then put its head back in the room. I immediately called out to the child, but no answer. The fear I had a minute ago was gone as I left the last room to go through the illuminated hallway. I made it to the other room in a matter of seconds, cutting on the lights and searching the entire room for the child I saw. But no one was there. I started getting spooked again as I cut off the lights in that room. Then one of the most terrifying things I'd ever seen and experienced happened. As I was leaving the room, I looked back at the last room's window, which illuminated the hallway, and out of nowhere, I see a massive black mass move in front of the window, almost covering the light completely. It was darker than black, and its outline as it covered the light seemed to be moving. It was enough to scare me to run for my life. I ran through the rest of the hallway and down the stairs. I was stopped by one of the ushers who told me not to run, but when I told him what I saw, he looked at me as if I was crazy. Once church was over, I told my parents about what happened on the ride home, and they ended up not believing me since they're skeptics. But I know what I saw that day, and it's something that still scares me to this very day. In 1999, I moved back to Washington State from traveling around the country for 4 years. My grandmother let me move in with her for a while so I could get back on my feet again. I hated the basement of her house, always have, but it was rent-free and she was cool with Chuck, my 90-pound black lab. Plus, my grandma and I got along pretty well. Late one night, at about 3 months in, I woke up because Chuck was moving around on the bed and he kept shaking the mattress. Then I heard him start grumping. You know those grumpy groans old dogs make when you scratch behind their ears and they love it? He started doing that. Once I realized what I was hearing, I sat up to yell at him to go back to sleep. That's when I discovered the reason he was moving around so much. He was trying to get closer to the woman standing right next to my bed, scratching him behind the ear. I didn't scream, and I'm proud of that. But also, what in God's name, where did she come from? Who was she? Why was she standing in my room petting my dog at 3 a.m.? All these questions I had in my head I was too scared to ask. I did the only thing I knew how to do in these situations. I hid under my blanket. Certainly she would be gone by the time I re-emerged from under the blanket. That's how these things are supposed to work, right? I waited for a little while, but when I came out from under the blanket, she was still there. So I hid under the blanket again, 3 more times. Every time I came back out, she'd still be there, smiling at me and scratching my dog's ear. The last time I was under the covers, I realized that I wasn't actually afraid of the woman. Chuck and I met under stressful situations for both of us, and because of that, he and I had a super strong bond. I trusted him implicitly. If she meant me harm, he would have reacted to her negatively. His reaction was clearly positive, so I figured that she probably wasn't there to kill me. So I came out from under the blanket one last time, intending to deal with the freaky woman still standing right next to my bed. Somehow I decided that turning on the light would make her disappear. I reached over and snapped the bedside lamp on. I don't know why I thought that would work. Is that even a thing? Are ghosts supposed to disappear in the light? Well, I turned on the light and she didn't, so I don't think that's a thing. By then, she'd been standing at my bedside, petting Chuck for several minutes, and I was out of ghost-busting options, so I gave up on being terrified and just looked at her. Really looked at her. I can still see her right now in my mind, dressed up in a classy brown pantsuit with a cream-colored blouse. She had shoulder-length auburn hair, styled beautifully with these big loopy curls. She looked like she'd been on her way to a work party, and she only stopped by for a second to say hello. She was very pretty, and she looked happy. I didn't have the nerve to talk to her, or at least I don't remember speaking, but I stayed present and we looked at each other for a while. I remember having the distinct impression of her knowing I was there, of both of us being aware of the other. Then she stopped petting Chuck and walked to the end of my bed, stood up straight and proud, and dissolved away. I mean that very literally. First her clothes, then her skin, organs, and bones. Like that guy at the end of Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. I remember what her blood looked like as it dissolved away to reveal her skeleton. That should be a gross and terrifying memory, but I don't remember it like that. At the time, it felt like she was doing it on purpose, like she'd wanted to leave with the most dramatic exit she could manage. I remember thinking, this should scare the pants off of me, but also, wow. Somehow, I got back to sleep. And in the morning, over coffee, I was going to tell my grandmother about what happened, but she just received an upsetting phone call. Apparently, her best friend from high school, Ursula, had passed away in the middle of the night. I'd heard stories about their teenage shenanigans, especially the one about the stolen birthday cake, but I never saw a picture of Ursula, so I asked what she looked like. Well, I couldn't tell you what she looked like these days, but when we were young, she had the most beautiful curly auburn hair. That's not the only weird thing that happened in my grandmother's basement, but it remains the most vivid and the least scary.
My kind of person.
Many of us encounter someone who just grabs our attention in a way that we can't explain. Like they know you from this or a previous life. I come from a long line of people who encountered ghosts, but I myself don't encounter the supernatural that much. I have in the past, but not often. Tonight, I know I did. This is not fake or made up. Our town is near a beach, and every 4th of July we go see the fireworks over the water. This year was no exception. Me and my wife arrived and set up chairs, settled in the sand, and chilled out waiting for darkness to fall and the fireworks to start. A slight breeze, a perfect, beautiful evening. About 20 minutes after we settled, I smelled a waft of what I can only describe as decayed roses on the breeze, like flowers in a vase that should have been thrown out a few days ago. It wasn't a bad smell, but just like sweet roses that weren't fresh. And then I saw her. From behind walked a young woman in jean shorts, t-shirt, and ball cap. She looked about 25 and had light brown wavy hair coming down about halfway on her back. I was immediately struck by her presence.
Get paid and
Not
get
because
out.
she was beautiful. I mean, she wasn't ugly. She was pretty, and she looked a bit off, though. Her face especially looked pretty, but weird, I suppose. Like her features didn't line up right or something. She stopped about 15 feet ahead of us and turned around. She looked right at me and smiled, then sat down in the sand. Again, she really did look off. something was amiss. But I was enchanted by this young woman. I looked at my wife to see what she thought, but got zero reaction, like she didn't even see her. I smelled the decayed roses on the wind again. This young woman in jean shorts and ball cap sat down, took off her flip-flops, and looked to the sky. She was sitting perpendicular to us but facing away. When I thought about it more, two things struck me as very, very odd. She had no electronics, no cell phone. Everyone on the beach was taking selfies and playing with their phones, even the elderly. This young woman had no visible phone, no electronics. Also, her clothes looked straight out of the 1970s. I grew up in the 1970s, so I know what normal people look like back then, and she had that 70s look. Totally down to the tomboy jeans and really just everything about her. She seemed very content just sitting there looking at the sky and not worried about cell phones or beach chairs or anything. Again, I smelled sweet, decaying roses on the wind. I took a picture of the whole scene on my cell phone. The pretty sky, the beach, and this strange woman. Shortly after, she got up and walked away behind us. I looked around to see where she went, but she disappeared. She was gone. When I got home and looked at the picture, I actually was not surprised to see she didn't appear in it. You might think I would have freaked out, but at some spiritual level, I really didn't expect her image to show up. Just a green orb appeared where she was sitting in the sand. I'm calm about it because I could tell she meant no harm. I really believe she was a person who passed away back in the 70s, and she was just checking in on me for some reason. I'm racking my brain to try and remember if I knew a young woman who passed away when I was a child back then. I just can't put it together right now.
An ally has been slain.
Into a house in Northamptonshire a few years ago and instantly felt something was odd with the house. That feeling when someone is watching you, cold drafts. My husband started feeling compelled to say things. He'd tell me what I'd done during the day with eerie detail. He'd tell me about a girl who talked to him, but in his head. Things started going missing or would be moved to random places. One day he said, "Gungoozler," out of the blue. I've never heard that word, nor has he. I just assumed it was another one of his made-up words, but it turned out it's a word meaning someone who's enjoyed watching canals. There are a lot of canals in the area and one in the village. When I asked why he said that word, he told me the girl had said it to him and she loved the canal. The weirdest thing that happened though was one evening when both my husband and our daughter wanted to shower. They decided hubby would go first, but as we sat in our bedroom, we heard the bathroom door close. The light goes on and the shower starts, so we assumed our daughter must have just beaten him to it. The shower ran for 45 minutes, and just as we're going to check and make sure she's okay, we heard the shower stop and her come out of the bathroom and go downstairs. The light was left on. My husband turned off the light and followed her downstairs and watched her go into her bedroom, which was downstairs. As he walked into the kitchen, though, our daughter walked back in the door. When he asked her how'd she gotten dressed and out so quickly, she told him she'd been out for the last hour seeing through her horses. So, who was in the shower? He saw a girl again a few weeks later, also stood in our daughter's doorway. Lots of other strange things happened there, but never anything scary, just freaky. Anyway, we moved a couple of years ago and nothing has happened since. Until this weekend. We went away to a hotel in Cornwall. On the first night, it was very foggy and cold. As we stood outside having a cig, he suddenly said, Joan is waiting in the summer house." I asked what on earth he was talking about. He had a strange look in his face and just said, "Joan is waiting in the summer house for Derek." Then he sort of snapped out of it, mouth hanging open, and said, "I have no idea where that came from." We talked about it and he said he felt compelled to say those things. He also felt she was military. We carried on discussing it for a while, then mid-sentence he said, "He's married and she's waiting in the summer house." A bit spooked, we decided to go back to our room. We searched on the internet and found out that in 1946, a young woman who was serving in the Navy was stationed at the hotel. Her name was Joan. She was having an affair with a married officer. When they were found out, she was transferred to another site in Devon. On the night she was due to move, she was waiting for him in the summer house where he shot her twice in the head. His name was William.
Has been slain.
We were totally freaked out. The man's name was wrong, but at that time, people used to be known by other names frequently, i.e. my granddad was John, but called Jack. My grandma was Grace, called Queenie. Perhaps he was really known as Derek.
Has been slain. An enemy has been slain.
I've always been interested in the paranormal and witnessed and experienced some events that I can't explain to this day, but I'm a very rational person, so I always brushed it off, while keeping an open mind, of course. But one of these experiences left me with no doubt. My current girlfriend used to work at a cafe bakery in an old building in Bordeaux. She used to close at night alone because she was the store manager and stayed after the crew was done to count the register, do all the paperwork, etc. The bakery consisted of the storefront, the kitchen in the back, and the office in the back as well. There's also a second floor which is only storage and the changing rooms for the staff. The building isn't shared, it was only the cafe bakery. She told me she felt uneasy as soon as her first shift there. Most nights, she'd hear running footsteps upstairs, the TVs in the sitting area for the customers turning off and on randomly, and the front door's doorbell ringing while the door was not moving. All that when she was alone. Another coworker she was close with shared the same experiences with her. I believed her because she has a history of paranormal encounters and is very serious about that stuff, but I wasn't convinced until I witnessed it. I also worked in the food industry, so I was rarely off when she was working too. One Sunday I was off, so I decided to come pick her up. We spent the last 30 to 45 minutes of the workday she usually spends alone with her this time. She gave me a tour of the place, and it did feel uneasy, but nothing significant happened, except for some rattling noises upstairs. Until I mentioned how quiet her ghost of the bakery was. She was counting the register in the office in the back of the store. I was leaning against the wall in the corridor leading to the office, my back turning away from the storefront. To my right, there was the dishwashing room. There was no door to this room, just an opening in the corridor. To better visualize, I was facing towards the office watching my girlfriend, turning my back to the storefront, leaning against the wall, but seeing the dishwashing room in my peripheral vision. Jokingly, I tell her, "I'm glad your ghost decided to leave us alone tonight." Not 1 second after I finished my sentence, the pile of glasses and dishes in the dishwashing room go flying. I saw the whole room clearly in my side vision, and there was no one or nothing that could have done that. There was a pile of glasses stacked up in a pyramid, and they flew as if someone ran their hand through the base. There wasn't one glass tripping and bringing down the pyramid. It was legitimately pushed off. She just told me, "I told you he's always there."
On a dull blade.
Since she's used to stuff like that happening, she was almost done, so we stayed less than 10 minutes in there, but I could feel a different level of oppression and uneasiness for the whole time. This one sticks with me because there's no rational explanation. I saw the dishes go flying around, and it was a direct response to my joke.
It's bought.
I have no other experiences that could be explained. I'd be happy to post them if you want to find an explanation or lack of with me. Driving through a ghost on a pitch-black forest road, seeing a school kid ghost sat on my bed at night, cats behaving weirdly. I've had a lot of paranormal stuff, but the one I just told is just outright the weirdest. stereotypical teenager from Japan. I'm male, and ever since I can remember, I have, throughout my lifetime, had recurring encounters with some strange people, be it in terms of looks or behavior. These encounters can happen anywhere from a week's space to several months, and it always seems like, when I do, it was their intention to meet me. My most recent one was on my way home from school. During my walk, I was looking down at my phone for a short moment, about to text one of my friends that I had planned to have over at my house later. As I looked up, a young man looking like he was in his 20s was approaching me a few meters ahead. This confused me for a minute as it was a straight and fairly long path ahead. I thought to myself that while I may have been looking at my phone, I would surely have noticed him coming from the corner of the path a good length away, or at least I expected him to be closer to that corner. But there he was, approaching from the middle as if he had appeared from thin air. His hair was dark brown, a bit unkempt but still good looking, and he had green eyes. His clothes were fairly ordinary too, keeping a sort of laid-back summer style to it. The most remarkable thing about him was his tattoo, or mark per se. A black line running from his left chin and down underneath his shirt. As he got closer enough for conversation, he stopped me and asked for my name. When I told him, he said that he heard about me before. And this confused me as not exactly a celebrity, but I thought nothing more of it. We then had some boring small talk, but he genuinely seemed pretty cheerful. Just as he was about to take off, he told me that I should probably wait for my friend. He didn't give me much of a chance to respond to this before walking off in the direction he came from. I thought about what he said and turned around to walk back to school. I glanced behind my back not long after, only to find that he was nowhere to be seen. As I made it back to my school, I sure enough find my friend waiting by the gate. She apparently thought that we were going to walk to my place together and had been waiting for me for quite a long time. I apologized and we began walking and, well, that's the end of it. I didn't tell her about the encounter, but I thought about it when she left. I didn't tell him or hint about my friend at all, so how would he have known? These types of encounters have kept on happening throughout my whole life, sometimes very frequently, and I don't know why.
I won't die.
These people I meet just seem too unreal, and usually know something I never told them about, which leads me to believe that maybe these people aren't human, after all.
An ally has been slain.
Get paid and get out.
I'm a 30-year-old female and had just woken up and was getting ready for the day in her bathroom, which is attached to our bedroom. If you look through the door, you have a full view of our bed and my sleeping 5-year-old son. I saw something adult-sized move past the door in the dark bedroom at regular walking speed. So I opened the door a bit and looked out. There was no one there and my kid was snoring. My husband should have been at work for 2 hours by this point. I checked our security cameras and saw nothing but my husband leaving for work earlier.
Laws or whatever.
And I chalked it up to my anxiety, sleep deprivation, as I'm heavily pregnant and can't sleep for anything right now. A few minutes later, I heard what sounded like an adult man humming, but it only lasted a few seconds. Can't name the tune though. I couldn't tell where it was coming from as we slept with the box fan on full blast right outside the door, and I had the exhaust fan on at the time. I looked out of the bathroom door again. Nothing. Am I going crazy, I thought? I took a deep breath and continued washing my face. The door was open about 2 to 3 inches, and the mirror in our tiny bathroom is one that covers most of the wall, from the counter to almost the ceiling. It's big, and you can see everything behind you and around you. The door is to my left right behind me. You could reach it and tap my shoulder. Out of the corner of my eye through the mirror, I suddenly saw something that wasn't there before. There was a hand reaching through the opening of the door, gripping the door frame right behind me. It looked like a grown man's hand and was at eye level. I froze, and then turned around half expecting my husband to be playing a prank.
kill.
because who else would be in here with me?
Enemy has been slain.
The hand was gone. I even checked through the mirror. Instantly, my child screamed, "Mama!" as loud as they could, and I jerked the door open. Nothing there but a scared kid's eyes wide open. He wasn't looking at me. "Who is that?" "Who, baby?" I was trying not to sound scared. He stared off into space for a few seconds, then seemingly forgot about whatever just happened. "Mama, why did you say my name?" "I didn't, baby. Did you hear your name? You said my name real loud and then you weren't beside me." "I was in the bathroom. I don't think I did, buddy." "It sounded like you." I checked the cameras. I checked the windows and doors. Every room and closet, shaking the whole time. Nothing. I feel safer living in this apartment than I ever have anywhere else.
Days.
Even alone, and I have bad anxiety. Like I said, if it was only one of us, I would have shrugged it off as sleep deprivation or night terrors, which my kid has never had, or something rational. But I'm asking all of you, what did we see
They're dead.
and hear? This was in 2014 or 15. My girlfriend and I were staying in a hotel called Stay on Main. I only learned later about the hotel's history. I only stayed there because it was cheap. That place was incredibly freaky, but anyway, I digress. My girlfriend and I were walking to a parking structure where our car was because we planned on going to Disneyland. As we were walking there, my girlfriend noticed a shortcut to the car down an alley. My instincts told me no. Let's just walk around since it's a nice day outside anyway. She insisted, and I said screw it, let's go. As soon as we turned into the alley, I noticed right away that a man in a hoodie quickly turned and followed us down the alley as soon as we went. I told my girlfriend under my breath, "Don't freak out, but we're being followed." I told her to run and get help while I fight him off. As we started to pick up our pace to create some distance from him, I noticed that this alley is a dead end. There's no way out but to go back from where we came. This man was closing his distance on us, had his hands in his hoodie pocket by the belly. I make a fist with my keys as I turn around to face him, ready to fight, as we pass a dumpster. I swear to God, guys, two men in perfect business suits with briefcases say good morning and pass us walking very fast. They popped up out of nowhere. They had black sunglasses and were white and tall, at least 6 feet tall. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't give them the greeting of the day back. I was just in shock. This man that was following us had turned around and sprinted out of the alleyway, which really showed me his true intentions. My girlfriend and I followed the two suited men out of the alley back to the public streets. Hoodie guy was nowhere to be seen, but then we somehow lost the two men in suits. I swear to God, they saved my life and my girlfriend's, my now wife. I'm convinced that they were angels who protected us from a potential tragedy. I still give my wife gut till this day about taking that shortcut through the alley. I was 7 years old and at a funeral, my grandfather's to be exact. I saw a strange man hanging out the back of the funeral home just watching everyone. He had a very distinct black suit with a nice pair of polished brown shoes and curly red hair. At one point I was back there near him, sitting on a pew, and he told me he knew my grandfather very well and couldn't wait to see him again. I remember he had a sort of pale look to him, like he was sick or something. Could have been the lighting, however. I told him something along the lines of me too and that I really missed him. I can't remember was pretty young at that point. It was weird because this man couldn't have been older than 40, and my grandfather was 90 when he died. He patted me on the shoulder, then turned and walked into the hall of the funeral home. I remember his hands were ice cold as his pinky grazed my neck as he patted me. I told my grandma and mom about him, and when we got home, she whipped out the photo album and asked if I could point the man out. There was an old grainy photo from the wedding day, and there he was in the same suit and everything. It turns out that man was my grandfather's father who had died 45 years earlier. I never saw him again, and I get chills thinking about it to this day. I never saw him before in a picture or anything, and my grandma, Lorraine, nearly fainted when I pointed out the man who had talked to me. She was the only one who believed me, and to this day, my parents think that I was playing a joke.
An ally has been slain.
So where I live in London, there's this outdoor exercise park I like to frequent as part of my workout routine. I'm sure most of you know the kind I'm talking about. The kind that's paid for with public money and is mostly just painted metal frames consisting of pull-up bars and the like. Between that exercise park and the free weights I have at home, I think I've saved myself a few £100 in gym membership fees. I used to love the place, and it provided a real sense of community. That might sound crazy coming from a Londoner, but the stereotype of us all being cold and aloof with each other is a bit of a myth, to be honest. But I hadn't even been near that little corner of Kensington in almost 2 years now, and honestly, I don't want to lay eyes on that place ever again. And I'll tell you why. So I'm hanging off one of the pull-up bars one day, trying to get that one extra rep on my set when I hear what I can only describe as a blood-curdling scream. I know that might sound sort of melodramatic, but those of you that have heard the scream of a person that's actually in fear for their life will know exactly what I'm talking about. It's a sound that elicits a physical reaction in you, like your brain takes over and says, "Time to go," pumps you full of adrenaline, and triggers that fight or flight response that I know a lot of you will be familiar with. In my case, I was feeling a little bolder than usual, thanks to testosterone, so I made the split-second decision to run towards the sound of the screaming. I jogged out of the park in the direction I'd heard the scream, just in time to see two people sprinting in the same direction. It was quite obviously a smaller woman being chased by a larger man, and with it being later on at night and in the middle of lockdown, I figured that no one else would be coming to help her. It was down to me and me alone. So I ran. I sprinted after the pair of them, shouting something to the effect of, "Oi, leave her alone." The chaser was wearing a hoodie and a baseball cap, and I remember the silhouette of him clear as he looked around for a moment, saw me, then carried on chasing the girl. I remember that scaring the bejesus out of me, thinking that he didn't care if he'd been clocked or not. He was going to keep chasing that girl. Didn't care if there was witnesses. I was honestly hoping that just me intervening would scare him off, so the prospect of dealing with such a psycho who was undeterred by imminent intervention, Christ, that put the fear of God into me.
You've got a problem.
But what else could I do? Just turn around and walk away? I wouldn't have been able to live with myself. So, like I said, I ran after them. And as I ran, I watched them turn down a dead-end street. I'm not sure if either of them knew it was a dead end, but I did. So as I followed them down it, I knew that whatever confrontation was about to occur, it was going to happen right then. But as I turned the corner and got ready to bark my head off while kicking the guy's head in, I was greeted with the single most confusing and unnerving sight of my adult life. There was no one there. And the only thing I could see was this dead-end street, some overflowing wheelie bins at the end of it, and some creepy-looking black street art depicting two human shapes. They were just shapes, no faces, no clothes. The kind of thing a kid would have just sprayed there in about 10 seconds. They were just stood there, still as statues, like they were staring right back at me. I'd never had a panic attack before, and I didn't even know what one felt like, so the fact that my vision went all cloudy and I suddenly found it hard to breathe, it was terrifying. It was only when I calmed down a bit and I thought to actually call the police. I mean, just because I'd lost them didn't mean it hadn't been happening or whatever. So, I called 999, told the operator what I'd seen, then went back to my flat to get a shower and some food. I thought I might calm down after that. I mean, you can understand why I'd been shaken up after something like that, right? I'd left my details with the police dispatcher, as I obviously wanted to be of more help if I could. They did actually end up phoning me back too. At least a uniformed officer called me back, but it wasn't to collect a statement or to ask me any more questions. I won't bore you with the nitty-gritty of the phone call. I'd rather not rehash every word, and I'm sure you'll understand why. The officers started off by confirming a few details: location, number of people being chased, number of people chasing, and that sort of thing. It all sounded totally routine at first, but then things took a more sinister turn. I was basically told in no uncertain terms that wasting police time was seen as a very serious offense. Not only that, but I was basically threatened with violating the newly instituted Coronavirus Act of 2020. I responded by telling the officer I was 100% serious about what I'd seen, that I wasn't wasting their time, and that I'd been partaking in my allotted daily exercise time. In response, the officer basically told me to pull the other one. He told me that he and a colleague had reviewed some CCTV footage from the area, footage which showed nothing more than a lone man running down the street before turning a blind corner. Basically, they told me I'd been chasing nothing but shadows, and if I made another false report like that, he'd personally make sure I was charged for both wasting police time and violating the COVID Act. I was speechless, and after the officer told me that I was entitled to make a complaint about it in the smartest way possible, he hung up. I was in a state of complete shock. It all seemed like a sick joke, one that I definitely didn't find amusing. I remember sitting down on my bed, on the verge of another panic attack, only that time, I'd actually found out what they were, and I knew how to deal with them. I wrapped a plastic bag around my mouth and nose and cycled my air until I felt kind of a woozy calm descend over me. Then, once I felt relatively normal, I called my mom back in Sheffield. I know it sounds a bit pathetic, a bloke in his early 30s running to mummy when he was upset, but I honestly didn't know who else to turn to at that point. I felt like I was going insane. I told her everything, absolutely everything, down to the last detail. And when I was done, Mom said something that had me on the verge of tears.
An enemy
I
is
remember what it
legendary.
was, word for word, and I don't think I'll ever forget. Dean, I'm your mom. I love you, and I'll always love you. But son, I think you need to get some help.
I've got value.
She launched into this big speech about how lockdown and self-isolation had really taken their toll on people over the previous few months. And maybe I was just having some kind of stress reaction to the whole pandemic thing. This was late spring of 2022, back when people were really scared. Not just vulnerable people or those with vulnerable relatives. I mean, everyone was really freaked out by this killer disease that had seemingly sprang up from nowhere.
Team has destroyed an
I'd already admitted to having panic attacks. Well, only one, but one was enough to have my mom really thinking that there was something wrong.
Your
I knew she was
inhibitor has been
concerned,
destroyed.
but she told me as much, but I didn't expect her to do what she did next, even if it was purely out of love and concern. A few days later, I got a call from a doctor, and almost instantly I knew what the deal was. It was a psychiatrist, and to his credit, he was completely honest about his reasons for calling. He said it wasn't an emergency, just that my mom had been in contact with him, and would I be interested in having a few over-the-phone counseling sessions to help with the stress of social distancing. It brought on mixed emotions. On one hand, my mom was so concerned with my well-being that she'd sought out medical health assistance for me. It was purely an act of motherly love. But on the other hand, the one person I needed to believe me thought I was going bonkers, so much so that she contacted someone who could actually contribute to me being sectioned under the Mental Health Act. There was only one thing that I was sure of in that moment, and that was that I hadn't imagined anything. Like I said, I had a physical reaction to that scream. I'd seen the guy chasing the girl. I could remember the sound her hard-bottomed shoes made as they hit the pavement. I could remember the sight of the guy's baseball-capped head spinning to clock me before I gave chase. I hadn't bloody imagined anything. It was real. It was all real. But then again, I was now faced with something of a dilemma. Either I keep talking about how I had apparently chased 2 pieces of street art down an alleyway and faced getting sectioned, or just admit that it was all just a manifestation of stress and take a prescription of Zopiclone or whatever it was the doctor wanted to give me. On the one hand, I wanted to fight my corner. I hadn't lied and I wasn't going crazy. But on the other, I didn't want to worry my mom any further, and I didn't want to lose my job. The company I worked for basically said that anyone that couldn't or wouldn't work from home was surplus to requirements and would have their weekly hours reduced to 0. So I did what I thought was best for my mom, and what was best for me in the long run. I rang the doctor back, told them I was just stressed out, and accepted their recommendation of Zopiclone prescription. At this point, I should make it clear that Zopiclone is pretty much just a sleep aid. There are no antipsychotic effects, none that were obvious to me anyways. I took one of the pills one night, and after that, I never touched the pack again. After that, I just learned to let the whole thing go. I know that all sounds preposterous, given how indignant I might have seemed in writing this, but sometimes, and I'm sure some of you will be able to relate to this, sometimes it's better to take what's called the path of least resistance. Some people want a resolution, a grand conclusion, to be able to draw a line under an experience and say, that's that, done and dusted, or I understand that, I get it.
Defeat.
But there's a lot to be said for the power of just forgetting about something. I know that seems rich coming from me, typing up some big essay after almost 2 years of trying to forget, but trust me, it's something I wish every single day that I could do. I feel like a moth dancing around a burning candle, wanting nothing more for the flame to be suddenly and finally extinguished. St. Lucie down here in Florida, and being something of a gun nut, I'd make weekly visits to a place called the OK Corral Gun Club over in Okeechobee. For a long time, the OKGC was just about my favorite place in the world. You could shoot off a few rounds, then head over to the club's restaurant for what I swear is the best turkey club I've ever tasted. Some of my fondest memories are from the OKCG, and since I took clients there on occasion to close deals, I'd like to think my membership fee paid for itself. But that membership ended on November 17th of 2017, when it was revoked by the club over an accident that occurred on one of the rifle ranges. It was an accident that I've never been able to fully explain, and one that almost ended one of the most enduring friendships of my life. Myself and Roger, my supposed victim in the story, arrived at the OK just after 8 in the morning. Definitely not our usual time, but since I had to take my kid to a Little League game later that morning, it was just about the only slot that we could fit a shoot in. I packed my custom M1, a World War II classic, with a modern twist that I'm still very much in love with. I had the metal parts parkerized with manganese phosphate, meaning you'd need a diamond cutter to put a scratch in it. And with the walnut handguard that I had fitted, it really is a thing of beauty. I also had the muzzle recrowned and the front and rear sights replaced with national match standard parts. The result was that I could shoot the butt off of a fly at 300 yards. I mean, any pro shooter in the country would have been happy to use that rifle. And I haven't touched it in just over 4 years now, and that's because it's the rifle that almost killed my best friend. I remember it was kind of chilly that morning. Well, about as chilly as you're ever likely to get in Central Florida. Me and Roger get ourselves some takeout coffee from the club's cafe, shoulder our gear, then headed down to one of the ranges. After that, we started off our usual ritual of blowing off steam in more ways than one. We'd complain about our wives, our kids, and our clients, and each bullet was like a little piece of tension just flying downrange. I swear sometimes we'd leave with this zen feeling of absolute calm, having unloaded both our consciences and our mags in one sitting. But that time, when it came to my third or fourth mag, something weird started to happen. It started with one missed shot, then two, then three. And remember, this is with one of the most accurate rifles on the planet. Roger shouted over to me saying something like, "They say the eyes are the first to go in old age, but Jesus, dude, you're shooting like a drunk stormtrooper this morning." I didn't even give him so much as a grunt in response. I was way too concentrated with identifying whatever was wrong with my beloved custom. So, as you can imagine, I started troubleshooting. I cleared the chamber, checked the ammo I was using, working my way through a little mental checklist when all of a sudden I hear, "What the hell?" I look up and Roger is staring at something downrange. Then he starts moving his neck back and forth, like a person does when they're trying to look at something from a slightly different angle. Then, before I can ask him what's given him the willies, he does something that you should never, ever do at a gun club. He starts walking downrange towards the targets. The rifle range had about 20 lanes on it back then, even more now, so I heard. And since it was so early in the morning on a weekend, there was only one other lane in use by a single other shooter. When Roger started to walk downrange, I look over to the other shooter who's in a similar state of shock as I was. I remember hissing something like, "What's wrong with you, man?" But he didn't even look back for a second. I tried for a second time to see what he was so transfixed by, and then I saw it, or rather, I caught a little glimpse of them. It was only when the sun broke from behind a cloud, casting a few rays of late fall sun onto something that glinted in the light. It was only then that I had a better idea of what I was looking at. I just had to wait for Roger to confirm it. As he got closer and closer, I called out to him, asking if he was looking at what I thought he was looking at. When he replied, I started to walk downrange too, just to make sure I wasn't going totally crazy. But lo and behold, hanging there in midair like they were stuck in some invisible wall, were 3 of my 30-06. I remember stopping dead in my tracks before instinctively backing away from them a few steps. I've never felt that kind of fear before, the kind when you're looking at something that just does not compute. Meanwhile, Roger is still just staring at the bullets, eyes all wide, mouth slightly opening and closing like a fish out of water. He was trying to find the words and was failing every time. Even though we were in a complete state of shock, completely absorbed by the raw curiosity of what we were seeing, at no point did Roger step in front of the floating bullets. I guess once you've got that muscle memory gun safety drilled into you, even something as sane like that can't make you neglect it. And that's the thing I had a hard time explaining to folks afterwards. Stuff already didn't make sense, but what happened next was somehow even more bizarre and terrifying than the floating bullets. When I finally got my train of thought back, the first thing that occurred to me was to take a picture of what we were looking at. I knew none of them would believe me. People still don't. And if I'd managed to get that picture, then it would have saved a mountain of trouble afterwards. But right as I got my phone out, I heard this faint, almost tinny noise, like the sound you hear after you hear a loud bang or whatever. I look up, and I swear to God, the bullets were vibrating. Not a lot, but they were definitely trembling very subtly in midair. I took another few steps back, not sure of exactly what was going to happen, but knowing enough to know it wouldn't be good. Roger did the same, turning a whiter shade of pale as he moved to his left to get even further away from the bullets. I have to make this clear for a third time now because at no point did he stand in front of the rounds. He remained, as I was looking at it, to the right of the bullets, facing me and them the whole time. Then right as the tinny noise reached its peak, I heard this supersonic crack, and and the bullets were gone. I remember looking over at Roger like, "Oh my God, did you see that?" Roger just looked at me, same wide eyes as before, then puts a hand to his shoulder. When he brought it away, there was blood on his fingers, and that's when he collapsed. I guess you can all figure what happened next. There was screaming, shouting. 911 was called. Roger was rushed to the ER, and as a precaution, I was detained by the cops.
Defeat.
I was worried, sure. I mean, I'd never even been arrested before, let alone for shooting someone. But all it took was Roger insisting that he didn't want to press charges, how it all been a horrible accident, and I was released. That all changed once Roger told the cops what happened. They got into their heads that something was going on, as in, I must have intimidated him into coming up with some crazy story to distract from the fact that I shot him. Somehow, it didn't matter that he walked down range. In fact, it was probably me that forced Roger to walk down there in the first place. After all, once Roger's now ex-wife got in his head that's when the real trouble came. She convinced him that all the floating bullet stuff couldn't have possibly have happened, that the only logical thing was that his best friend in the world had just up and shot him for no good reason whatsoever. Didn't matter that he'd seen all the same stuff as me. Didn't matter that he wasn't even standing in the path of the bullets. All that mattered was that someone had to take the blame, and for a long time, that person was me. Like I said, it was all that stuff that almost ended our friendship. I know he was a mess around that time, emotionally and physically, and we've since put all that behind us. But his ex got all up in his head, told him what he saw was impossible, that it was all his way of rationalizing that his best bud had tried to murder him. It took until the cops got their hands on the security camera footage, thank God for that, for them to actually drop the case against me. I mean, they knew something had happened, something real messed up, but it wasn't anything they could charge me for, especially since it was clear that Roger had walked down the range of his own volition. After that, it was just a case of me and Roger patching things up. I'd rather not go into the whole divorce thing he went through. It was pretty upsetting for everyone involved, and I don't really feel like it's my story to tell. But needless to say, we had a pretty emotional reunion not long after he filed the papers. We're still close, real close. The kind of close you can only really get when you go through something truly terrifying. I know there's a scientific explanation for what happened to us that day. There has to be. I just think it's one that science hasn't quite reached yet. Maybe there will come a time when all sorts of things are easily explained through science, or metaphysics as Roger has taken to calling it. It's just a shame it's not now, because, let me tell you, it would have saved me and my best friend a whole world of trouble.
I could do better.
I was born and raised in the Catholic Church. I believe in God, I believe in the devil, I believe in good and evil. I believe in an essential order to the universe, one that can be occasionally cruel, but one that makes sense in the grand scheme of things. I am also an amateur astronomer. Some people say those two things don't really go together, that no matter how much I search for the heavens, I'll only ever be looking at the stars. But to me, that's besides the point. I don't believe that my faith precludes me from appreciating some of God's finer works. And believe it or not, there's no denying that the night sky is one of the Lord's more incredible creations. That being said, I once witnessed something that, to me, made absolutely zero sense. It didn't shake my faith, and in fact, I feel like it's even stronger as a result. And it's something that neither myself nor anyone else has ever been able to successfully explain. So, imagine you're me for a second. You got your telescope set up in your backyard. You have a hot cocoa on hand. It's one of those perfect, silent, cloudless winter nights, one almost tailor-made for amateur astronomers such as yourself. You're checking off your favorite constellations, nodding hello to the bovine face of Pleiades, counting all 4 of Jupiter's bright Galilean moons, when suddenly, your lens goes black. At first, you kind of jump back from the telescope because your lens only normally goes dark, like if something is in the way of the scope. You're relieved to see that no one's there, as a strange person slightly manifesting in front of your scope in the middle of the night would be a whole mess of trouble. But then you're kind of worried because your $3,000 telescope is out of warranty and you can't exactly take those things down to Walmart to get them repaired. But then, something compels you to look up, and that's when you realize that the entire night sky, moon and all, has gone completely dark. At first, I know this might sound like a terrible cliche, but I actually thought I was either dreaming or seeing things. I remember blinking hard, the way you do when you're dreaming as a kid and you're trying to wake yourself up from a bad dream. But when I opened my eyes and looked at the sky again, I realized I wasn't just imagining the whole thing. The sky had gone from its regular celestial glory to a ceiling painted matte black. Suddenly, I realized I must have been witnessing a once-in-a-lifetime astronomical event, a kind of celestial eclipse, the likes of which would be talked about and dissected for generations to come. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck standing up while this great electric tingle went through me. I thought about trying to capture the event on my phone, and as much as I wanted to, I found that I just couldn't move. It was pure hesitation, half of thinking it'll just be a blank black picture, and then I figured I could make a video of the stars flickering back on, but that's when a very, very frightening series of thoughts occurred to me. The first being, what if they don't flicker back on? What if it's not some kind of mass, heavy cloud cover? And what if it was? Surely I'd be able to see the ambient light from the moon lighting up the clouds. And that's when this feeling of intense panic started to rise up inside me. I appreciate this might sound a little melodramatic, but I began to wonder if I was witnessing something less wondrous and more apocalyptic. As those thoughts and feelings began to take hold, I was suddenly gripped by the desire to run back into my house and wake my wife. I didn't know what was about to happen, but whatever it was, if it was bad, I didn't want her to be taken by surprise by it. And as I tried to move, I couldn't unglue my gaze from the darkened skies above. And that's when I saw it. I can only describe it as the entire sky shifting, like I was looking at nothing but a jet black canopy that suddenly and violently shifted before my eyes. I know that sounds illogical. Like, how could I know it was moving if there was nothing but pitched black up there? But trust me, my brain registered the movement, so much so that I felt almost dizzy from it. It was like a black wing moved over the earth, and right as it passed over us, I saw the heavens light up again. Every single star in the sky, including the moon, flickered back to life in an instant, and that feeling of vertigo hit me even harder than before. I stumbled backwards, falling on my butt like a toddler who was still learning to walk. Then once I'd picked myself up, a singular thought occurred to me. Check the internet, check the news. I remember running to my desktop, bringing up a browser window, then checking every single news website I could think of. I expected to see headlines consisting of things like, breaking news, starlight blackout shakes America, or what just happened in the skies over North America. But there was nothing. Just ads for blackout curtains or Quora questions about when the sun is going to burn out. In frustration, I called an astronomer friend of mine that lived up in Maine, and as soon as he answered the phone, I knew he'd be no help. He sounded groggy, like I'd just woken him up. And as it turned out, that was exactly the case. And just in case, I asked him if he'd been watching the skies over the past hour or so, but it was no surprise when he said no. He must have been able to hear the tension in my voice, however, because he quickly started asking what was wrong. And that's when I launched into this long diatribe regarding what I'd just seen. Admittedly, I was a mess of what I'd seen, my ideas on it, the prospect of it being a world-shaking event. It shouldn't have surprised me that he'd interrupt to tell me, "Steve, call me back in the morning, man. I'm too tired for this right now." But it did. It hurt a little, having such a close friend and fellow astronomer disbelieve me, but at the same time,
Get paid and
I understood
get out.
why he was so skeptical. I suppose that was what the likes of Galileo felt, discovering the world was round but having everyone think he was nuts. I checked the news again in the morning, found nothing, then immediately called my friend up in Maine. I told him the same story down to the last detail, but when I was done, he said something that nailed shut the coffin lid of my story. "Steve, I think you should go see a doctor." That was the last time I told anyone what I'd experienced.
business.
Even my wife doesn't know what happened to me that night. I still search online from time to time, looking for any trace of newspaper articles, historical accounts, or eyewitness reports of what I'd come to call the blackout. But still, there was nothing. No matter how hard I looked, there was no historical accounts which matched up to what I'd seen that night.
It's
Eventually, I just dropped it and I tried to get on with my life without dangerously obsessing over the blackout. I didn't want to think that I was crazy, and I did take my friend's words to heart. I kept on sky gazing, but told myself that any repeated incidents, and I'd go straight to a doctor to tell them what I was experiencing. But it didn't happen again. It's never happened again. And I feel like if it had, or anyone, anywhere in the world, they'd have posted about it online by now. I suppose I should have done the same a long time ago, created a kind of marker stone for anyone who might experience or witness the same thing. But I didn't, and that's what I suppose I'm trying to correct in typing this all up. I still don't know what happened that night. I still don't know what I was looking at or what moved across the sky that practically knocked me on my butt. But I think the only thing that stopped me going crazy is the strength of my faith in God. I think I saw the hand of my Creator that night. Or at least, that's what I choose to believe, because the alternative, any alternative, is almost too terrifying
but gold
to
stays.
consider.
Heroes go hungry.
A few years back, in my early 20s, I lived for distance running. It was something I kind of fell into as a way of losing what my mom affectionately referred to as puppy fat, and at first, I hated it with a passion. But after I started to see results, I kept at it, until eventually, I think I was straight up addicted to what's called runner's high. After that, I signed up to my first race. It was just a little 5K fun run, and I didn't even place top 10, but after that, it was part of my personality. I was that runner girl in my family, as well as my circle of friends. I must have spent just shy of 1,000 pounds on specialist running shoes, ankle tape, knee supports, nipple tape, you name it. Running was something I'd be doing until I didn't have the breath in my lungs to carry me anymore. So, would you believe me if I told you I haven't been running in almost 3 years now? Personally, if you had told me in my prime that I just dropped running one day, never to don my Lycra leggings ever again, I'd have called you a liar. But then again, if you have looked into a crystal ball and told me why, I think I'd have understood. To explain why, I have to tell you the story of a girl named Vanessa Marcotti. Vanessa was born in June of 1989 on the other side of the Atlantic in the U.S. state of Massachusetts. She went to the University of Boston, then went on to work for Google in New York City. From what I understand, Vanessa was happy, healthy, and successful, the daughter of 2 very proud parents. But in August of 2016, Vanessa went out for a run and never came back. Her body was found on a running trail in a forest not far from her home, with burns on her face, feet, and hands. Her killer had choked her to death, broken her nose, then humiliated her after he'd taken her life.
I've got that.
He also stole her clothes, her earbuds, things like that, and he also left plenty of himself behind at the scene, if you catch my drift. According to the articles I read, Vanessa's injuries mostly came from having put up quite a lot of resistance during the attack. Her killer was so enraged by the fact that she actually hurt him back that she dared to put up a fight, that he'd beaten her and burned her. The police arrested a guy for her murder, and I'm pretty sure the trial is yet to happen because I've got a Google alert set to notify me and I've heard nothing about it so far. But that's not really why I'm telling you this story. The point is why some random murder on the other side of the world stopped me from doing something I love most in the world. You see, Vanessa was killed in her home county of Worcester, Massachusetts. I live in Worcester, England, and my name is Vanessa Marcotte. All that's different about our names is one little E. Vanessa was born in June of 1989, the exact same month and year as me, with our birthdays being less than a week apart. Vanessa's parents are named John and Roseanne, and my parents are named Ross and Jean. Vanessa had brown hair and brown eyes, and yep, you guessed it, I also have brown hair and brown eyes. You know that tired old cliche of my blood ran cold whenever a person sees something scary? It's true. It's exactly right. I remember feeling like I had ice in my veins as I read more and more about Vanessa's life and death. We were twins in more ways than one. More than twins in some ways. It was like we were the same person. I know that sounds mental, and I suppose to some of you it might sound like I'm trying to make this poor girl's murder all about me. There is such a thing as coincidences after all. But like 10 different coincidences, all in a row, you can understand why I'd be so freaked out. Only that's not what stopped me from running, not entirely. That happened almost a week later. As I've already touched on, I was freaked out by the other Vanessa's murder, but it wasn't enough to put me off running entirely. My route was open, in public, safe. But then I go out running one day and my route is almost completely empty. It ran around the edge of quite a large park, with houses lining the entire route. There was always someone out there, be it a dog walker or another runner, sometimes even a sweet old couple enjoying an afternoon walk. But that time, my last time, it was completely deserted, all except for one man. He had short hair, glasses, and a dark blue anorak. That much I remember about him. I saw him looking at me as I passed him in my first loop, but that's not entirely unusual. It's not nice, but wearing skin-tight clothes draws a lot of looks from the opposite gender, even if most are trying to be discreet about it. The way he looked at me was fairly creepy, but it didn't give me much cause for alarm. However, when it came to running my second loop of the park, I just couldn't do it. I know it must sound slightly crazy to the more rational of you, but I just couldn't shake the feeling that running that second loop and bumping into him again would be the end of me. I'd just end up like Vanessa, beaten, violated, mutilated. We were twins in more way than one. Our lives had been mirrored images in so many ways, I didn't want our deaths to be the same too. I gave it a week, told myself I'd give myself a break, then get back to running when I felt up to it again. Then, a fortnight went by and I still hadn't put my running shoes on. Then a fortnight became a month, and a month became half a year, and so on and so forth until here I am. 3 years later, and I've never once gone running again. These days I do a lot of burpees, then skipping rope when I want to save my knees. I'm thinking about investing in an exercise bike too, at least when I have the money to afford one. Anything but running, to be honest, because part of me knows deep down that me and Vanessa's existences are mirror images. And as long as I stay away from my once beloved jogger, I'm gonna live a long, happy life. did a little solo hiking around Yellowstone.
An enemy has
I was a
been
junior
slain.
in college, and I barely made it through the year thanks to the amount of partying I was
Shut
doing.
down.
I was determined not to mess up the final year, so I decided to completely dry out by hiking around Yellowstone for the better part of a week. It was honestly one of the most awesome experiences of my life. I learned a lot about myself while also confirming that I could still have a good time without drugs or alcohol playing a starring role. As you can imagine, given how beautiful Yellowstone can be in the summertime, I took a lot of photos. Photos of incredible views, photos of creeks and streams and ponds, and also photos of my sleeping setup. A lot of the time I just sprung up a little tarp up in the trees, then stuffed myself in my sleeping bag before dozing off. A few of my college buddies just didn't believe that I was doing something so out there, as I definitely wasn't the outdoorsy type before that period. Naturally, I was only too happy to prove them wrong. So whenever I set up my shelter, I'd take a few pictures before climbing into my sleeping bag and passing out. I always checked the pictures just after I took them, then took another few if I needed better angles or lighting. So while I was there, I didn't actually check the entire camera roll on my iPhone. I figured I'd seen them all as I took them. So when I went back home and started showing my buddies the pictures, I wasn't expecting the unexpected. But then again, when are we ever? I'm swiping through the photos, happily soaking up how impressed they were with my little adventure, when I suddenly see a picture that I don't recognize. The picture was of my sleeping setup, only instead of being taken from a few feet in front of it at ground level, it looked like it had been taken from like 50 or 60 feet up in the air. Not only that, but I could clearly see myself passed out in the sleeping bag, like the picture had been taken in the very early morning. One of my roommates says something like, "Whoa, dude, nice angle. Did you climb up a tree or something?" I didn't answer him right away. I was completely flabbergasted by what I was looking at, and that's because the place I'd been sleeping that night looked out over a wide open space. Basically, there were no trees in front of where I was sleeping, let alone any high enough to get the kind of angle the photo had been taken
Got
at.
a problem?
My roommate noticed my prolonged silence and asked me what the matter was. Again, I just couldn't find the words for a few seconds, and when I could finally speak again, all that came out was, "I didn't take that picture." Obviously, they didn't think that there was anything amiss with that at first, so their follow-up question was, "Well, who did? I thought you were alone that whole time." I just turned to them, looked them in the eyes, and just said, "I was." Only then did they really start to understand how weird it all was.
I won't die.
And thank God that they were there at the time I discovered the pictures, because I'm not sure I'd be able to keep a lid on my emotions if they hadn't been there. While I tried to keep calm, they began to rationalize what we'd been looking at. Their first idea was that some creepy prankster had come along, taken my phone, climbed a tree, then taken a picture of me while I was asleep. And while that wasn't entirely out of the question, since my shelter was open-faced and it'd be easy to get to me, it was obviously impossible. When I broke it to him that there were no trees in front of my shelter on that occasion, and that the very reason I'd chosen it was for the views, he actually accused me of being mistaken. It was only when I'd lost my temper that he actually sat down on my couch and just stared off into the near distance. We both knew the photo was physically impossible, so the question was, how could it have been taken? It stayed on our minds for days afterwards, and no matter how hard we racked our brains over it, neither of us could come up with a solution.
Loyalty isn't
Finally, when I approached him with the idea of revisiting Yellowstone to try to get some answers, he flat out refused. Not only that, but he told me that he thought I should just delete the picture to let go of the whole subject. Someone played a prank on me, he said. That, or it's a glitch with the phone or something. Either way, it's just not worth obsessing over. You're okay, I'm okay. We're both still young and sane. Let's not go and do anything to compromise that. And he was right somehow. What answer could I possibly have gotten that was going to ease my mind or make me feel better about the whole situation? Even the Occam's razor explanation creeped me out. that someone had taken my phone out of my sleeping bag, then replaced it after having taken an impossible photo. Anything beyond that, well, my roomie was right. I really didn't want to know what else it could have been. It was better I just get on with my life, try to forget it even happened. But I still think about it every now and then. I can't help it. And sometimes I think that if I do finally get answers on how that picture was taken, it'll be more terrifying than I can possibly imagine.
Heroes go hungry.
An enemy has been slain.
I made
An
my
ally has been slain.
Have you ever had a hallucination? I have. And it was one of the scariest things that's ever happened to me. At least, I think it was a hallucination. One night I got home from work pretty late after working overtime on a project that was due at the month's end. I was tired, pretty burned out, and definitely stressed. But as a doctor later told me, being stressed and sleepy doesn't cause vivid visual hallucinations. So, right as you come through the door of my apartment, there's a lamp that I inherited from my deceased grandma. It's one of those old-style ones with a fabric shade which has little tassels hanging from it. And after she died and we were going through her stuff, I just couldn't bring myself to throw it out. It probably wouldn't have fetched $5 at a garage sale, but to me, it was as precious as anything. A relic of a time gone by, and a reminder of how magical visits to her house used to be. I'd look at it and smell freshly baked Christmas
A
gingerbread.
summoner has
I'd switch it on and off and feel like she was in the room with me.
whatever works at the
Not in the
time.
creepy way, of course, more like in a very comforting way. But this one evening, I walked through the door, switch it on, and feel my heart getting ready to jump out of my throat. When I looked up, all I could see was naked human bodies. They were almost gray, with a thin sheen of what I can only describe as slime on them. Almost like the kind you see on a baby deer or cat right after they pop out of their mothers. They were stacked on top of each other, some of them maybe 3 or 4 bodies high. But they weren't dead. They were breathing, and in a lightning flash of realization, I understood that they weren't just unconscious or sleeping. They were being born. They weren't babies either. Not fetuses or zygotes or whatever you want to call them. They were fully grown adult humans covered in amniotic fluid, and they were waiting to be born. And then there was the smell that drifted into my nostrils, a scent that reminded me an awful lot of warm milk. As you can imagine, this just about scared me out of my mind. I didn't take my hand off the lamp's little switch, not for a second, and out of instinct, all I did in the moment was switch the lamp off again.
Wealth is
When my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could see that the bodies were gone, but I was so shaken up that I didn't switch the lamp back on. I just walked out of my apartment and began pacing in the hall. When I felt calm enough to enter the apartment again, when I told myself enough times that what I saw was just my mind playing tricks on me, I walked back into the apartment and switched the lamp back on. There was nothing there, just the soft, warm light of my grandma's lamp reflecting back at me off the walls. I sought psychiatric help immediately, and as I stated, a doctor helped me realize that what I'd seen was nothing more than a figment of a fractured and fatigued imagination.
get out.
I always thought hallucinations would be fuzzy or more abstract, melting wallpaper patterns and pink elephants, that kind of thing. I didn't realize they could present themselves in such intimate detail, or be accompanied with things like smells or sounds,
Enemy has
like that warm milk smell I detected.
An ally
But
has been slain.
here we are. You live and learn. And I'm thankful to the medical staff that helped me realize that. But in my darkest moments, especially in those that followed the incident itself, I sometimes thought that what happened to me wasn't just some kind of cerebral picture show. That smell, the way the bodies sounded as their lungs drew and expelled breath, that slimy, oozing sound. Not to mention the detail on their faces, on their bodies. The moles, the hairs, the birthmarks, the scars. I remember it all in such vivid detail. But like the doctor said,
Shut down.
it had to have been a hallucination, because you can't just summon something like that by switching an old lamp on and off. We don't live in a world like that. I know we don't. Because if we did, we'd hear a lot more stories like mine. Only, I've never actually gone looking for similar stories because honestly, I don't want to know if similar things have happened. Because if I read that they have,
Honor is the
that would put a hot needle point at the balloon of my carefully created sanity. And everything I've worked towards over the past 20 years or so could suddenly and violently burst.
Kings come and go, but gold stays. Heroes go hungry.
A few years back, I got a call from a private number. I don't usually answer those kind of calls, but I was expecting one from my local tax office and was told that they call from
I make
some
my
sort of
own
private
fortune.
number. I answer the phone and it's not the tax woman. It's some kid saying like, "Hello? Dad? When are you coming home?" The line was terrible and I could barely hear the little guy, so I had to ask him to repeat himself before finally saying, "Sorry man, I'm not your dad. I think you got the wrong number." Only thing was, the voice sounded weirdly familiar. So my first thought is that it was a second cousin or one of my friend's kids getting the wrong number or something. It was only a little while later that I realized who it was on the other end. It was me. The night my dad took his own life, I called him and asked him the exact same thing. He told me he'd be home in the next few hours, but he didn't ever come home again. I can't explain how or why it happened. I just sank my head into my hands and cried. I'd never told anyone this story, but I'll tell you because I suppose it doesn't matter either way. You don't know me, I don't know you. And if we did meet, you'd never know it. But it happened. And I know it must have happened to other people too.
Laws or whatever.
I just
works
wonder
for
how
us.
many, and if it'll ever be properly explained. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations.
Shut down.
I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
This is
If you got a story,
desert.
be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data. Located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.
Your turret has been destroyed.
Wealth is my kind.
Back when I was in university, I joined the Walking and Hiking Society, and in stark contrast to the rather boring name, they oversaw some of the most exciting trips abroad the uni had to offer. Every year, they'd organize trips to some of the best hiking spots in the world, and during my second year, the destination happened to be the Carpathian Mountains. For those that don't know, the Carpathians run through several different Central European countries, but the vast majority of them are in Romania. The Carpathians are home to some of the wildest forests in all of Europe and are also home to some rather frightening wildlife. There are brown bears, wolves, lynxes, all things you definitely wouldn't want to bump into while taking that early morning bathroom break. But it wasn't the wildlife that made our Carpathians trip so creepy. It was a group of people we ran into after getting ourselves lost in the Rodna Mountains National Park. So, you're never really lost in the woods, not if you're a good enough navigator. If you have a map and a compass, some food and some water, you can always just push on until you figure out where you are based on landmarks and whatnot. That's why when the leader of our hiking group, a younger professor we called George, said we might have taken a wrong turn down one of the trails, we weren't panicking or anything like that. In fact, it actually felt quite exciting thinking that we were venturing into the unknown. After all, you never improve your skills unless they're actually tested, and there's never any real growth without true discomfort. We knew we had to cross one particular mountain, and the key to do it was finding this one particular mountain pass. And as you can imagine, that's easy enough to do. All you have to do is find the spot where the mountains dip low enough, and Bob's your uncle. There's your way through. So it was simply a case of finding an elevated position, finding where the range dipped, and just orienting ourselves towards it. Easy peasy lemon squeezy, I thought. Then, off we marched in the direction of the pass. There was just one little problem, and that was the issue of sustenance. Because we all focused on having an ultra-light kit, we'd taken minimal food and water with us and planned to stop off at various little villages along the route in order to take on supplies. And given that we'd missed one of our village stops due to getting ourselves a bit lost, we ended up running out of our substantial food supplies. This wasn't a huge problem as we still had a few cereal bars and glucose gel packs to keep us going, and finding fresh water from mountain streams was surprisingly easy. But on the day before we planned to navigate the pass, we were all starting to feel pretty hangry as a result of the shortage. So, at one point we all decided to take a break while George and another member of the group decided to scout the area to see if they could find any sources of food, wild or otherwise. About 2 hours after they departed, they returned with some good news. They'd spotted what looked like a small village up in the mountains, one that wasn't on our maps but was definitely populated since there was smoke coming from various chimneys and whatnot. The plan was to show up, be very polite, and offer them some cash in exchange for whatever food they could give us. We didn't give a monkey's butt. We had to pay over the odds for it. We were that hungry, and we would have paid triple the going rate for a decent hot meal. So, that was all it took to get us on the move again, and with the promise of full stomachs, we found ourselves with renewed energy to walk a few miles up to the mountain village. It was definitely a bit nerve-wracking. I mean, what if they weren't friendly, or just straight up refused to sell us anything despite us offering them a fistful of cash? If we took the gamble and it didn't pay off, we'd have a terrible time crossing the mountain pass. A person can go a long time without food, and we had enough water to last us, but we'd definitely be in a bad way once we got to the next village after the pass. Passing out from hunger is bad enough at best of times, but pass out and tumble down the mountainside, and that could be the end of you. So, you can imagine how elated and grateful we were when we reached the village, and they were actually quite welcoming to us. I say quite because, as much as the bloke we offered money seemed over the moon to have us trudge into his village, some of the other villagers seemed less than impressed at our presence. I really don't mean this to sound too mean or ungrateful because they literally saved our butts out there, but a lot of them just didn't look right, if that makes sense. I wouldn't have been surprised if there was a bit of inbreeding going on, put it that way, and some of them had this faraway glassy look in their eyes, like there wasn't too much going on between their ears, get my drift. So, as much as we were happy to be eating some proper food for the first time in like 24 hours, we were quite keen on getting out of there too. We were offered goat milk and goat meat, a few baked potatoes, pretty basic food like that, and My God, did it taste amazing, even with what little seasoning they used. After that, we spent about an hour just relaxing and digesting with full-on food babies until we realized, in a bit of a panic, that sunset was fast approaching. But then, when it came to asking the village head man to help us find the mountain pass, he casually refused and kept making hand gestures that we interpreted as tomorrow or in the morning. A quick show of hands showed that almost no one was focused on bedding down in the village overnight, and given that some of the other girls complained that some of the village boys had been giving them some rather unsavory looks, they'd rather take their chances camped out in the mountainside than stay in the village overnight. And given how we could literally hear wolves howling on the preceding nights, that was really saying something. So, that's how we ended up packing up our gear, thanking the village head guy after giving him a big chunk of change, and heading off into the twilight to find somewhere to camp. Once we walked a fair distance away from the village, we all started setting up our little tents and whatnot, got a few fires going, and after warming ourselves and laughing about the close call we had, we all tried to get some sleep before the busy day ahead of us. We really did need to get all the sleep we could get, as traversing the mountain pass was going to be a heck of a lot of work, even with the food in our bellies. It turns out, no one would get any decent sleep, on account of the visitor we received in the middle of the night. I remember being shaken awake by the girl I was sharing the tent with, who told me in this really shaky, scared voice to put my boots on. The next thing I know, I can hear George, the professor leading our group, calling out to someone. He was saying things like, "Do you speak English? Are you from the village? We're leaving in the morning and we don't want any trouble." Whoever he was talking to wasn't saying anything back, and it was around then that I put my boots on and stuck my head outside of the tent to see if I could get a look at the person. Only it wasn't just one person. It was about 4 or 5 different people, stood on a rise above our campsite, shining flashlights down onto us. At least, I think it was only that many, because that's how many torches that they were shining down on us. There could have been a lot more that we couldn't see. We didn't know who they were or what their intentions were. We had no idea if they were from the village or not, if they intended to rob us and take the rest of our money, or something even worse. Like I said, there were a few of the village boys who seemed to have taken an unhealthy liking to some of the girls in our group, and my own personal worst fear was just that they'd found our camp and were intent on dragging 1 or 2 of us away for you-know-what. Thankfully, a few of the guys came out of their tents to see what was going on. Their torches switched off and we heard the sound of boots on rocks, then silence, meaning whoever it was had retreated. We all breathed this collective sigh of relief, but like I said, sleep didn't come easy after that, and that's if you were able to get any sleep at all. At first light, we packed up our things and headed off in the direction of the mountain pass. It was seriously tough on next to no sleep, but thankfully the food in our bellies and the fear in our chests motivated us sufficiently to make it all the way to the other side by the early afternoon. We were all elated by the time we made it across and down onto the lush green fields on the other side. It was like a little slice of paradise right before our eyes. And the best thing, we could clearly see quite a large village just a mile or 2 away. One that would certainly have access to food and, more importantly, alcohol. I personally needed a strong one after the day that we'd had, and luckily, there was a small bar in the village square that was only too happy to provide us with these big bottles of plum brandy they called Palinka. And the owner of the bar was quite proficient in English too, which certainly made our lives easier, and he ended up asking us about our trip. Obviously, one of the first things we told him about was our run-in at the mountain village. How it started out as a rather nervy encounter that turned into a seriously creepy midnight confrontation. When we told him, he gave us this rather bemused look, before telling us that we must have been confused. According to him, there were no villages around the mountain pass, and that they'd all been demolished during the communist era, with the occupants being moved onto collective farms. We all sort of gave each other these funny looks as if to say, well, that can't be right, before informing him that he was mistaken. If the government had deported all those mountain people, it looked like they'd moved right back up there as soon as the Iron Curtain fell, so to speak. The conversation then moved on to us asking why the government had done something so cruel as to deport entire villages away from their homes, and shockingly, the bar owners seemed to have very little sympathy for them. He launched off into some speech about it being the best thing for them, how they were all illiterate and they needed to be dragged kicking and screaming into the modern world. We thought this was a bit harsh, honestly. I mean, everyone is entitled to live the way they want to. At least, that's the way I see it. But he disagreed. He said if we knew the truth about what they did up there, we wouldn't be so sympathetic. Then, without a hint of jest or hyperbole to his words, he tells us that they're cannibals, and that they eat the weakest of their own number in order to conserve resources. Not only that, but they steal the breast milk of their pregnant women to distribute among the men of the village. That's when one of us piped up that one of the first things they'd shared with us was meat and milk. Of course, they'd claimed it was goat milk, but none of us had ever drank it before, so how would we know the difference? The man looked absolutely horrified when we told him this, then promptly walked away from our table before disappearing behind the bar. Our group looked equally horrified, at least until a few of the older members spoke up that the bloke was either seriously misinformed, horrifically bigoted, or was just playing some elaborate joke on us that he could share with his regulars for a good old laugh. This one guy named Adrian was saying something like there was absolutely no chance, that they were a bit backwards, but cannibals, no bloody chance. And I'm very much inclined to agree with him on that. We were in Romania, not some random isolated island, and given the grinding poverty they were suffering, it was almost an impossibility that they'd share anything as precious as milk with us, even if they were bloody paying. After all, there were tons of goats trotting around the village, plenty of females with swollen udders too, so I can almost categorically say that we didn't engage in cannibalism, nor did we drink any of the women's milk, so to speak. The only thing that really still scares me to this day is the gang of mysterious people who we encountered, the ones who shone torches down on us from the ridgeline above. No one with any innocent intentions just rolls up on a camp of sleeping people like that. They didn't say a word to us, didn't greet us in Romanian, and you think they'd at least say something to us to ensure their good intentions, even if it was in a language we couldn't understand. After all, it's all in the tone of voice and not so much exactly what you're saying. It makes me wonder what would have happened if there hadn't been so many of us, if it had been just all girls or the lads hadn't come out of their tents for an unintentional show of force. Sometimes I don't think they were just curious about us. Sometimes I think that they had something very, very bad in mind for us, and we're all extremely lucky that they didn't go ahead with whatever they were planning. I don't think it was the nicer guy who fed us either. I don't think it had anything to do with him. I think it was the younger lads who had been ogling the girls in our group, and I think they'd have been monsters given half the chance. All in all, it was a wonderful trip, just one that was slightly marred by a rather unpleasant nocturnal encounter. The people we met in Romania were, for the most part, some of the kindest, most welcoming people one could ever wish to meet. But there were a small few, and I say this in no uncertain terms, that might have done things to us that meant we never made it home alive.
Welcome to Summoner's Rift.
I won't die for one.
On April 5th of 2017, 22-year-old Californian cyclist Jacob Gray set off from Washington State's Port Townsend, intent on cycling through the Olympic National Park. The bike he was riding was a specialized hard rock that some believe was slightly too small for Jacob. It was just an inch below 6 foot. Yet the bike had sentimental value, as it was a promotional model that his father had won at a contractor's show raffle. Attached to the rear of the bike was a used red and yellow
Minions
child
have
trailer,
spawned.
one that Jacob had loaded with the camping gear before setting off into the wilderness. Jacob was later sighted in Indian Valley in a Long Crescent Lake on April 5th, while on the morning of April 6th, a woman drove past him as he rode down the Solduck Hot Springs Road.
Cut hurts.
Then, later that afternoon, she noticed his distinctive red and yellow trailer on the side of the road. It wasn't a good place to camp or stash a bike for long, as it was highly visible among the foliage. Jacob was nowhere to be seen, but little did the woman know, Jacob would never be seen again. A few hours later, his abandoned gear was found by park rangers, who noted something odd about the setup. A bow was lying on the ground next to the abandoned bike and trailer, and not only were arrows jammed into the dirt near the bike itself, but arrows seemed to have struck the red and yellow trailer which held Jacob's possessions. The ranger in question, a man named John Bowie, then proceeded to search the immediate area, believing the bike's owners may have stopped at a nearby spring to collect water. But again, Jacob was nowhere to be seen. Bowie then contacted the fellow park ranger and asked him to recheck the area the following morning. He expected the bike's owner to have returned to remove his gear, but the frame and trailer were still there on the morning of April 7th. A park ranger then searched Jacob's abandoned gear and found a list of phone numbers which identified the gear's owner as Jacob. He then contacted one of the people on the list, who turned out to be Jacob's sister, Mallory. Then once Jacob's parents were informed of his abandoned gear, the grave nature of the situation became clear. At that point, Jacob Gray officially became a missing person. The next day, the Clallam County Sheriff's Department combed over the area using around 30 different deputies and sniffer dogs to try to track down the missing cyclist. Even with all the manpower, they failed to locate him. A few days later, the Sheriff's Department enlisted the help of volunteer trackers from the Olympic Mountain Rescue. This team of dedicated specialists were much more adept at tracking the movements of missing people, and as they searched, they made a series of curious discoveries. They found compelling evidence that someone, most likely Jacob, had swapped a pair of hiking boots for running shoes before walking to the edge of a nearby river. There, they appeared to have slipped and fallen, leaving a distinct mark on a mossy rock. At about 30 yards downstream, there were signs that this person had managed to pull themselves out of the river, eliminating the prospect that Jacob had drowned before being carried downriver. They doubled down on this theory by having team members search the log jams further down the river, but no trace of any body was found, and the search continued. Yet despite the ongoing efforts, on April 14th, the status of the search for Jacob Gray was changed to that of limited continuous search. This meant that rangers were no longer looking for a living person, as it was believed to be impossible for Jacob to have survived almost 2 weeks without protection from the elements. Search and rescue teams moved on to other tasks, leaving the search for Jacob to be headed up by volunteers only. This was extremely demoralizing for Jacob's family, but they refused to give up, and over the coming months, they personally organized at least a dozen searches of the Olympic National Park. Flyers were posted on park kiosks and gas stations in the Port Angeles area,
An enemy
and
has
the team
been slain.
consisting of Jacob's friends and relatives handed out leaflets to people hiking through the park. This culminated in a huge 100-man search along the Solduck River in July of 2017, but only a pair of Burnside brand shorts in Jacob's size were recovered, a pair that matched an item he'd been given as a Christmas gift that previous year. This briefly renewed the family's hope of finding Jacob alive, but over the year that followed, the lack of any additional findings meant that the searches had to be scaled back, and a grim acceptance set in that they'd never see their beloved Jacob alive again. More than a year later, on Friday, August 10th of 2018, a team of biologists ventured into the Olympic National Park in order to study marmots. They found themselves atop a ridge above Hoh Lake, and it was there that they made a horrifying discovery. Along with his clothing, some of his gear, and his wallet, the team of scientists found what remained of Jacob Gray's lifeless body. This spot was more than 15 miles from where Jacob abandoned his bicycle, so
What exactly prompted the young man to abandon his things before climbing up so far into the mountains? Despite the discovery of a bow and arrows near his abandoned bicycle, and after identifying Jacob via his dental records, a coroner argued that there was very little evidence of foul play. He had a cigarette lighter, insulated clothing, and plenty of food with him at the scene where the body was found. Yet it was soon determined that the only rational explanation was that Jacob has somehow succumbed to hypothermia, as during the April he went missing, the terrain had been covered in a thick blanket of snow. However, this completely ignores the fact that Jacob's remains were little more than skeletal by the time they were found. There could have been any number of fatal wounds to Jacob's biodegradable tissues that would have been impossible to identify. It's also worth noting that when lost in the wilderness, most people know well enough to head down hillsides instead of climbing them. The last thing you want to do is end up stranded on a mountain when you could hike down to more temperate climates. But a person being pursued by someone or something might well climb up a mountainside in order to escape something chasing them, especially if that thing had previously fired at them with a bow and arrow. There's something else worth noting too, and that involves the items found in the vicinity of Jacob's skeletal remains. He was carrying a Bible with him. It seems when he abandoned his bicycle, he grabbed only what was completely essential for his survival: the lighter, the food, and the warm clothing. What would possess him to bring the Bible along? It's possible that he wished to use the pages as kindling, yet despite how badly degraded they were by the elements, the Bible's pages showed no signs of being ripped or torn. Just what was it about a Bible that Jacob saw as being essential to his survival? What was chasing him that he believed the holy text might be a salvation? There have been many that argued that Jacob's intention was to take his own life and that carrying the Bible with him was an attempt to counterbalance the mortal sin that he perceived himself to be doing. But this raises the question: if Jacob intended on taking his own life, why bother bringing so much survival gear on a trip that would ultimately end in his death? It's entirely likely that Jacob wanted one last biking trip before going through with the act. But that theory completely ignores the fact that a bow and arrow were found at the site of his abandoned vehicle. It's not out of the question that Jacob brought these items along with him and intended to use them as some part of survivalist-style exercise. Yet if that was the case, why were arrows shot into the ground at an angle which would suggest they were being fired at Jacob? And if he was being attacked, he could have at least tried using the bow to defend himself. Only he didn't, which leads us to believe that an attacker was wielding the bow. But what kind of psychopath stalks from the forests of Washington hunting for human game? Who could have terrified Jacob so much that he'd have preferred to risk the freezing mountainside than risk walking back down into the woods? Did Jacob really get lost in the woods, as some people contend, or rather, was he stalked, attacked, and then chased up the mountain by someone who still walks among us today? October 10th of 1954, Juliana Kopka was born in the Peruvian capital of Lima to German biologist Hans Wilhelm Kopka and his wife, ornithologist Maria Kopka, who were in the employ of Lima's Natural History Museum. When Juliana was just 14 years old, her parents departed Lima to establish an Amazon jungle research station known as Panguana. According to Juliana herself, she became a jungle child, learning more about survival techniques than mathematical equations. Her schoolhouse was Panguana, and her playground was the jungle itself. Yet despite such an unorthodox education, the Kopkas took their daughter's education very seriously and ensured that she both studied the correct materials and took the proper examinations. So when she was 17, Juliana was scheduled to fly back to Lima in December of 1971 in order to take her school's Leavers exam at Lima's German
An
school.
enemy has been slain.
She passed with flying colors and became an official graduate of the school on December 23rd of 1971. The following day, Juliana and her mother flew back to Panguana via a Peruvian airline known as LANSA. Due to the holiday season, every other flight was booked, and despite Hans's objections to them using an airline with a poor reputation, Juliana and her mother had very little choice if they wished to be back in Panguana for Christmas. Yet they had no way of knowing what a monumentous decision it was, and how it would lead to catastrophic consequences for young Juliana.
I make
In the middle of the flight, Juliana's plane was struck by lightning, and unlike modern aircrafts, the Lanza airplane was both poorly designed and poorly maintained. The lightning strike caused cataclysmic damage to the plane's hull, and as it began to disintegrate in midair, the plane took a nosedive and plummeted to the ground. The craft separated into pieces during the descent, and Juliana's seat was torn from its moorings. Within seconds, she found herself falling 2 miles down into the rainforest below. It seems impossible that anyone could survive such a fall, but incredibly, Juliana somehow endured. Many have credited the fact that she remained strapped to her seat as it absorbed much of the impact. But even so, Juliana suffered a broken collarbone and sustained a severe gash to one of her arms. She was the flight's only surviving passenger, as every single other person aboard perished in the crash. Yet, even though she just survived a 10,000-foot fall, her hellish feat of endurance had only just begun. For the next 9 days, Juliana was forced to limp through the humid, insect-infested forest, surviving on nothing but rainwater and half-rotten fruit that had fallen from the surrounding trees. She was practically eaten alive by blood-sucking insects, and as maggots began to infest her wounded arm, the pain was almost unendurable. Anyone else might have died within just a few days, but thanks to her experiences growing up in a jungle environment, Juliana was able to utilize the skills she'd learned as a child in order to sustain herself, as well as avoiding the many death traps that such terrain presented. After just over a week of dehydration, starvation, and barely any sleep, Juliana finally stumbled across an empty encampment. She rummaged through the camp supplies, giving herself basic first aid, but there was still the matter of ridding her wound of the maggots that had infested it. She found some antiseptic wipes that were soaked in pure alcohol, but they weren't enough to reach the deeper portions of her wound. However, Juliana did find a can full of gasoline, and despite the immense pain it caused, she poured the flammable substance into her open wound in order to rid it of the flesh-eating maggots. The agony just about pushed her over the edge, and as she found a cot to lay down in for her first real rest in just over a week, her life teetered in the balance. Miraculously, with timing that was nothing short of divine providence, the missionary party who had constructed the camp returned within just a few hours of Juliana's arrival, and upon finding her, immediately called in a helicopter airlift so that she could be taken to a hospital. It took weeks for Juliana to recover from her injuries, but once she fully recovered, she assisted search parties from the Peruvian government in locating the Lanza plane's crash site. She helped recover almost all the bodies of those lost in the plane crash, but there was only one she truly wanted to find, that of her mother, Maria.
Honor is the rust on
Juliana finally found her mother's corpse on January 12th of 1972, and with her father's help, repatriated it back to Germany for a proper burial. It was an incredibly emotional affair for both father and daughter, and naturally, it left an indelible impression on young Juliana. Over the years that followed, she opted to follow in her mother's footsteps. She studied biology at the University of Kiel and went on to receive a doctorate from the University of Munich. Following that, Juliana returned to Peru to conduct research in mammalogy, specializing in bats. Then, following the death of her father in the year 2000, Juliana took over as the director of the Panguana Research Station, carrying on her parents' legacy and overcoming the trauma she suffered as a result of her nightmarish experiences.
Your turret has been
Juliana's story
destroyed.
was documented by world-renowned filmmaker Werner Herzog in a picture he titled Wings of Hope. Herzog was interested in telling Juliana's story not just because of how enthralling it is, but also because of how deeply personal of a connection he had to the tale. You see, Herzog himself was actually scheduled to fly on the very same flight that crashed in the Amazon back in 1971, and it was only a last-minute change of plans that saved his life. Herzog was haunted by that fact, and if he had indeed taken that flight, it would have been his body that Juliana helped recover following her convalescence.
Is what I'm paid for.
Such a detail amounts to another chilling twist to an already horrifying tale of loss and survival, and reminds us that our own end might just be a twist of fate away.
I'll fight for a cause. Die for one.
Your team has destroyed.
On the night of November 14th, 2015, two Welsh brothers named Andrew and Mark Middle were out camping in the Clocaenog forest in northern Wales. They were there to watch the 2015 Wales Rally, an annual off-road car racing event which both brothers were extremely
Your
enthusiastic
turret
about.
has been destroyed.
So enthusiastic that they would opt to camp out in almost sub-zero temperatures in order to maintain the perfect vantage point to watch the powerful vehicles
I've got
hurtle past them.
values. They stack up
Given how
nice.
cold it was, the brothers would naturally need to maintain a campfire in order to keep warm, and as anyone who's had to keep a campfire going overnight, it requires a lot of firewood. The brothers had collected an ample stack of dry kindling that afternoon, but
and get
as the
out.
night set in and a brisk November chill set in, they found their supplies of firewood dwindling. Apparently, it was Mark's turn to go out and collect some, so he grabbed his flashlight, threw on his woolly gloves and hat, then set off into the pitch-black forest to gather firewood. It's more than likely that, given the time of year, the forest floor is very cold and damp during the night, and we can quite safely assume that Mark Middle's search for sufficiently dry kindling took him much further from his campsite than he would have liked.
My kind of burden.
Then, before he knew it, all of the trees started to look the same, and among the dense, verdant foliage, he realized he'd lost sight of the warm glow of his campfire. Realizing he'd gotten himself lost, Mark called out to his brother, who immediately responded. Then all Mark had to do was follow the sound of his brother's voice, and he'd soon be
An
back
ally
at
has
camp.
been slain.
Yet the Clocaenog forest is so dense and wild in
Enemy
places
double
that
kill.
a few blind footsteps might send him crashing into the dirt below. So to ensure this didn't happen, Mark shone his flashlight on the ground beneath him to make sure that he was clear of trip hazards. Back at camp, Andrew Middle was only mildly concerned about his brother calling out to him. Although it was very dark, Mark hadn't walked far, and he would most definitely be able to find his way back to camp from the sound of his
Your
voice.
turret has been destroyed.
What followed was a variation on the famous pool game Marco Polo. Mark would call out to Andrew, and Andrew would call back, until suddenly, Mark went quiet. Then, through the pitch darkness, Andrew Middle quite clearly heard his brother, and a voice that sounded both astounded and horrified say, "Oh my God." Andrew recognized the fear in Mark's voice immediately and asked his brother what the problem was. Mark stayed quiet for a second, staring in disbelief at the object at his feet, then called out to his brother, "I think you better come and see this." Andrew grabbed his own flashlight and rushed out to find his brother white as a sheet and staring at the ground. Andrew then looked down to see what he was looking at, then muttered his own exclamation of "Jesus Christ." Half buried in the earth, caked in moss and filth, was a human skull. Mark and Andrew quickly made their way back to their campsite and immediately contacted police. Emergency services received the call at approximately 8:35 p.m., and by 9 that night, a local police officer had arrived at the scene to confirm the discovery. The officer was quickly followed by a forensics team who sequestered the area off before searching for additional human remains. Hidden just beneath the earth, the team discovered a complete human skeleton that they believed had been deposited there between the years of 1995 and 2005. It was only then that the Middle brothers were informed of something truly horrifying, that the ground they'd been camping on had been once used by notorious serial killer Peter Moore as a dumping ground for men he had murdered. They hadn't just pitched their tent on any old patch of forest. They'd made a camp on a veritable graveyard. What followed was a 5-week-long investigation that involved combing missing persons databases, pathological examinations, and intensive DNA profiling. It was determined that the man died from blunt trauma to the head, and that he had been murdered in an unknown location between 2004 and 2010.
The only thing I look up
The
to
victim
is
was
this
said to
guy.
have been a well-built man in his 60s at the time of his death, standing between 5'8" and 5'10". Some items of clothing were found near the body consisting of a dark green Pringle jumper and some dark red decomposed Marks and Spencer underwear, but it could not be confirmed that they were associated with the victim. Numerous attempts to identify the man via his DNA and teeth were unsuccessful, and in March of 2017, police confirmed that they had approached Peter Moore with questions regarding the man's identity. Moore claimed that the body did indeed belong to one of his victims, a 46-year-old mature student at Aberystwyth University who had disappeared in 1996. Moore refused to reveal the victim's name, but journalists identified a Roger Evans of Gradley near Stoke-on-Trent as a mature student who had indeed gone missing in 1996. However, police later announced that this theory had been discounted due to conflicting dates, and to this day, the identities of both the victim and his murderer remain a complete mystery. However, the prevailing theory is that Peter Moore is indeed the man's killer, and simply fed the police a string of false information in order to throw them off the scent. Moore was famous for claiming that his murders had actually been committed by a fictitious homosexual lover he nicknamed Jason, after the killer in the Friday the 13th movie series. He might have found a great deal of satisfaction in finally having deceived those that sent him to prison on a whole life order. The identity of Moore's apparently murderous lover was never uncovered, and despite jurors having decided that his claims were complete fiction, he might have found a great deal of satisfaction in finally having deceived those that sent him to prison on a whole life sentence. The identity of Moore's apparently murderous lover was never uncovered, and despite jurors having decided that his claims were a complete fiction, they might have been very, very wrong. Moore was not only aware of someone who had gone missing in the year following his string of killings, but the victim was found mere yards away from where Moore's other victims had been found. There's a very good chance that Moore was indeed involved in the murder in some capacity, but if he didn't personally murder the victim, who did? Is it possible that Moore wasn't lying when he spoke of this Jason character? Is it possible that he'd been part of some kind of kill team back in 1995 when he committed his crimes? Or did the body simply belong to Moore's uncredited fifth victim? One, his record will forever remain untainted by this fifth body thanks to a well-thought-out deception. As frustrating as it may be, these are questions that might never be answered, and with Moore rapidly approaching his 76th birthday, the time to get concrete answers is quickly running out. So, next time you're camping and you're out collecting firewood, be careful where you tread. Instead of finding something to warm your bones, you might find something that will make your blood run cold.
An ally has been slain. Your team has destroyed a turret.
Let me tell you the story of how I became a pescatarian. I had a very privileged upbringing in New England. I'm talking very privileged. The old stereotype is that every little girl wants a pony for her birthday, and my reality was that I actually got a pony for my birthday, my 12th to be exact.
He was a Cremello Welsh pony, and it was love at first sight. I named him Custard, and during the summer of 1997, I rode him almost every single day. I mostly rode him around land my family owned just outside of Norwalk, Connecticut. But most weekends, I ride him further afield with my mom, who owned her own house and knew the best riding trails in Fairfield County. It got to become a regular thing, and as I learned more and more about Custard and how to take care of him, the more I became convinced that the rest of my life was going to involve horses and ponies in some shape or form. It became my dream job, something I thought would fulfill me and sustain me until retirement. But one day, someone took that dream away from me in an event that changed my life forever. For the longest time, Mom would always ride ahead on her prized Andalusian, saying that she'd only let me lead once I had proper control of Custard. But there came a point when I asked for her, like the 1000th time, and she finally looked back at me and nodded with a smile. I was so excited. All I ever wanted was to feel free like that, cantering with Custard through the woods, feeling like we could ride all the way down to Mexico, just like the cowboys in the movies my dad loved. Half the reason I called my pony Custard was because it was what I used to call General Custer when I was only half out of my baby talk years. And although we always rode in the prim and proper hard hats and jodhpurs my mom always wore, in my head, I was always in a plaid shirt and jeans minus the spurs, but always topped off with a well-worn Stetson. I guess I rode a little too far ahead at some point, because when I slowed down and brought Custard to a stop, I looked around and didn't see Mom behind me. I know I should have just turned back to meet her, but it felt so good just being alone out there in the woods. Just me and Custard alone in the wild frontier. So instead of turning around and cantering back to meet her, I just kept Custard trotting along the trail nice and slow, soaking up how quiet and still everything was on that unseasonably balmy fall afternoon. I guess that should have been my first warning. There was no bird songs, no sounds but those of Custard's hooves padding through the soft dirt below us. Then, just as I was about to call out for my mom, my whole world ended in the space of maybe only half a second. For long stretches of our rides, I looked down at the back of Custard's neck and at the top of his head, just completely and utterly smitten with him. I loved his ears and the way they twitch and tense as he listened to different distant sounds, how his blonde mane glowed golden whenever sunlight hit it. I was doing exactly that just as I was about to call out for Mom, so my eyes were right where they shouldn't have been, when his just disintegrated before my eyes. The loud bang in the near distance barely even registered as he fell over to one side and hit the dirt hard, mainly because he'd trapped my left leg under him, and the pain that shot through it was like nothing I'd ever felt before. Then, because I was trapped, I was held in place and basically forced to witness what remained of my poor Custard's head. And that was the only mercy, really, knowing he hadn't suffered at all when the bullet that killed him passed through his skull. But my God, the mess it made. Seeing all that raw flesh and brain matter spread across the trail, it literally scared me for my life. The hunters made it over to me before Mom caught up, obviously terrified by the sounds of my screams. We later found out that they'd gotten lost in the woods and had lost track of where their hunting grounds ended and where the horse trails began. I don't know what their problem was, if they were just dumb or in some way malicious, but they claimed they thought Custard was a deer or something, that their hide made it hard to tell, but they just took the shot anyway. Mom made sure that they faced the full force of the law for what they did, had them arrested, sued them for damages, the whole 9 yards. She remained convinced that it was no accident until the day she died, and honestly, I'm inclined to believe her. And I'm glad that they had their various licenses revoked for life. People like that don't deserve Second Amendment rights. Either they're too dumb or too evil to be allowed to own guns. It just sucks that they didn't receive any prison sentences or anything. They took a life. They deserve to be locked up, in my opinion. But the laws in this country basically turn animals into property, and killing one that belongs to a person is basically no different than breaking one of their car windows. I had to go through a lot of therapy just to be able to go outside again following Custard's death. and I still find it extremely triggering to see horses anywhere, hence why I was never able to follow up on my dream of working with them or ponies. I also found myself extremely adverse to almost all kinds of meat afterwards, as it just reminded me of all of that. I'm okay with almost all kinds of seafood except for tuna steak, as things like shrimp or crab are so far removed from mammalian flesh that I'm actually able to stomach the sight of them. I still think about Custard far more than I should, considering he died 25 years ago now, and I also think of how those hunters got away with their lost in the woods excuse when I think in reality, they knew exactly where they were.
Where the trouble is. I make my own fortune.
I'm from a place called Plymouth in southwest England, and for the longest time now, I've gone on long runs over the weekends to keep up with my fitness. Last June, I decided to go for a long one along the cliffs and through the forests of Bulberry Down and over Beck's Gardens. I've never been before, and I've heard it's a really beautiful place, with the sea air really invigorating you as you run. Just as I was getting closer and closer to the 10th kilometer mark, the old brain fog started to descend. I got myself a bit lost and ended up missing the turn I needed to go back on myself so I could get back to my car. The next thing I know, I'm seeing signs for a little town called Sulcombe, but since it was coming up to about 4:30 and it was still bloody roasting out, I thought I'd just head into the village, maybe grab some water, then ask directions back towards a place called Marlborough, so I could run back towards the place I'd parked my car. Anyways, as I'm running down this hill into Sulcombe, I suddenly find myself really needing a wee. Just one of the problems you face when on one of those long runs. The water you drink just comes right out the other end in like half an hour. But luckily, there was this wooded area where I thought I could just hop off the road to drain the main vein behind a tree. So as I said, I took a quick look around to make sure no one was watching. Then I ran up this little grass verge and into the woods. I'm still thoroughly lost at this point, having never been anywhere near Sulcombe before, but I thought I'd be relatively easy just to ask for directions and be on my way within the hour. Little did I know, I wouldn't be running back towards Marlborough or my car. I'd be headed back to it in a police car, after stumbling across something truly horrifying after taking a whiz. So I take my leap. Then as I'm walking back towards the open road, I see something lying in the dirt, wrapped in bin bags. As weird as it sounds, my first thought was that I'd stumbled across the dumping ground of some local serial killer. But it was just a bit of melodrama in my head talking. Just a dark joke that I thought would remain exactly that. Besides, it wasn't shaped like a body. It was more just like a junk covered in a bin liner, more likely to be someone's fly tipping than anything else. But then as I got closer to pass it on my way out of the woods, the smell hit me. I'd never smelled death like that before, but I knew what it was. If you've ever left some chicken in the fridge for too long, and there's that gag-inducing ammonia smell, it was just like that. That's what I was hoping it was anyway, as I walked over and nudged the opening of the bin liner wider with my running shoe. Just someone's rubbish they decided to dump somewhere after missing bin collection day or something like that. The first thing I saw was like a cut of meat, like perfectly sliced too. But then I saw what was obviously the stump of a person's neck on top of their shoulders. They'd been decapitated.
Your turret has been
I started to gag, and I ran back onto the road, puked up the water I'd finished off on the way into Sulcombe, and immediately called the police. Given that I was the person who found the body, the police told me to wait where I was so I could answer a few questions, and it was honestly even scarier when I realized they thought it was me that might have dumped it there. It was easy enough to clear myself of suspicion though once I told them my story, and when all was said and done and the forensics team had showed up and put tape around the woods, the officer was nice enough to give me a lift back to my car, which was parked all the way back near Hope Cove.
The sky.
I was actually a bit worried that I'd get a fine for public urination or something, but the police weren't in the least bit interested in such a petty crime when they had an actual murder on their hands. They also ended up getting back in touch with me a few days later, asking if I'd seen any suspicious activity in the area on the day of my run. Anyone hanging around near the little bit of woodland, anything leaving in a hurry after I showed up, but obviously, I already told them that the place was empty when I jogged to relieve myself, so I just reiterated that old point, and that was the last I heard from them. I later found out that the victim was this poor old Malaysian lady. I think she was in her 60s when she was killed. I haven't heard about any killer being arrested, so it must have still been an ongoing thing over here. It took me quite a while to get over this whole thing. Like, I still get a bit nervous about being near clusters of woodland, wondering what other poor sods have been found in such sorry states over the years. Just dumped somewhere, wrapped in bin bags like somebody's unwanted rubbish or something. And it's horrible to think about, really. I hope if you read this out on your channel, someone in the UK might be able to look this up and realize that they know something about the victim or her final days. Whoever did those things to her deserves to be in prison for a long, long time. And the fact that they're still just walking the streets is enough to turn my stomach. Of the infamous and multiple prison escapee Richard Lee McNair. Thank God for prisons. There are some very sick people in them, animals you would never want living near your family or the public in general. I don't know how corrections staff deal with it. They get spit on, abused, and I have seen them risk their own lives and save a prisoner many times. Never was a truer word spoken, and the United States has had its fair share of vicious and dangerous prisoners, and arguably none were more bloodthirsty or more deadly than a monster by the name of Thomas Silverstein. Silverstein was born to a divorced mother in Long Beach, California on February 4th of 1952. His mother, Virginia Conway, divorced Silverstein's biological father while he was still in the womb, then married and eventually divorced another man before settling with a one Sid Silverstein, from whom Thomas inherited his surname. Silverstein grew up as a shy, awkward, and timid child who was often severely bullied by his middle-class neighbors. Not only was he singled out as a lower-class child of divorce, but his adopted second name meant that he was often mistaken for being Jewish, which meant that Thomas became the victim of some unforgivably vicious anti-Semitic comments. When Silverstein would arrive home in tears, seeking comfort from his mother, she would rebuke his innocent vulnerability and demand that he take violent revenge on those that had wronged him. Then, when Thomas refused to partake in such hideous retribution, she told him that if he ever came running home to her again, crying because he had been beaten up by a bully, she would be waiting to beat him up even worse than they had. Silverstein later said that, "It's how my mom was. She stood her mud. If someone came at you with a bat, you got your bat, and you both went at it." Following this cruel ultimatum, Silverstein committed his first act of violence, beating one of his bullies to a bloody pulp in the street outside his home. When she found out, his mother actually expressed approval of the act, and once the young man felt the warmth of his mother's pride in him, a life of violence was simply inevitable. At the tender age of 14, Silverstein was sent to the first of many correctional facilities after a conviction for violent conduct. It was there, at a California Youth Authority reformatory, that his attitude towards violence was harshly and definitively tempered. Life inside was dog eat dog, a constant fight for survival, and as Silverstein later put it, anyone not willing to fight was abused. Later in 1971, a 19-year-old Silverstein was sent to San Quentin Prison in California for armed robbery. It was around this time that he fell under the influence of his mother's second husband, Thomas Conway,
himself an accomplished armed robber who schooled him in the tricks of the trade. Just months after he was paroled for his first armed robbery conviction, Silverstein was sent back to prison with his father and cousin after being convicted of 3 separate armed robberies that netted a paltry $11,000. The cycle repeated itself in 1977, and just months after he was paroled from that second conviction, Thomas was convicted for his part in an even more violent and terrifying armed robbery. And given that he was an unrepentant recidivist, he was sentenced to 15 years in Leavenworth's federal penitentiary. It was at Leavenworth that Silverstein first met members of the infamous Aryan Brotherhood, and being the viciously violent and hardened criminal that he was, the Brotherhood's leadership was deeply impressed with him. When the year 1980 rolled around, Silverstein was offered full membership to the Aryan Brotherhood, but he was required to prove his loyalty by spilling the blood of another prisoner. The Brotherhood had asked a young man named Danny Atwell to serve as a heroin mule for them, which would require him secreting drugs inside himself in order to transport them to another part of the prison. The drug trade was extremely lucrative to the Brotherhood, and they mostly relied on narcotic sales to fund their operations both in and out of the penitentiary. Few prisoners ever refused the wishes of the Brotherhood. To their surprise, Danny Atwell flat out refused to run the risk of an extended sentence for them. Such a refusal was a grave insult to the Brotherhood's leadership, so in response, they decided that Atwell had to be killed, and the man to do the job would be none other than Thomas Silverstein. Silverstein knew that the chances of him being caught and convicted of murder were extremely high, but given that, by that point, he saw no other life for himself outside of prison, he accepted. He then talked his way into Atwell's cell on the pretense of getting him out of trouble, then cut the poor soul's throat with a homemade knife that the Brotherhood had provided him with. As he expected, Silverstein was quickly apprehended, and after a swift trial, he was sentenced to life before being transferred to a United States penitentiary in Marion, Illinois. While incarcerated at Marion, Silverstein's behavior took a distinct turn for the worse. He was now a full-blooded member of the Aryan Brotherhood, one of the most violently racist prison gangs in American history, and his behavior reflected that enormously. He became so violent and disruptive that prison staff were forced to house him in the penitentiary's control unit, a sequestered area of the prison with a regimen that verged on constant solitary confinement. After tricking prison staff into thinking that he had somewhat reformed himself, Silverstein used his newfound freedom to assassinate an African-American prison gang member named Robert Chappelle, who was a veteran of an organization known as the DC Blacks. Once again, Silverstein's involvement in the murder was swiftly uncovered by the prison staff, and he was handed yet another life sentence. When word reached the leadership of the DC Blacks that Silverstein had murdered one of their own, it came to pass that the national leader of the gang, Raymond Cadillac Smith, ended up getting transferred to Marion Penitentiary, specifically to the control unit that housed Silverstein. It's not clear whether this was pure coincidence or some deliberately antagonistic power play instigated by federal penitentiary staff, but what's clear is that 2 men who shouldn't have been anywhere near each other ended up just a few feet apart. As prison logs would later confirm, Cadillac Smith spent most every hour of every day either plotting or attempting to murder Silverstein. Thomas, on the other hand, chose to sow seeds of doubt and conspiracy in Smith's mind, insisting he was completely innocent of the charge and that internal strife with the DC Blacks was to blame for Chappelle's murder. But Smith wasn't fooled, and as Silverstein would later state, everyone knew what was going on, and no one did anything to keep us apart. The guards wanted one of us to kill the other. Silverstein believed that someone high up in the ranks of the penitentiary's leadership had engineered his and Smith's close proximity, and that it was only a matter of time before mortal combat ensued. They proved him right. Somehow, Silverstein and Smith ended up face to face, with each in possession of improvised weapons. It's not clear if Smith finally found a window of opportunity to attack Silverstein, or if the guards arranged for them to be alone together, but after a lengthy struggle, Silverstein came out on top. having stabbed Smith more than 60 times in the torso, neck, and face. Only once Smith was dead, Silverstein didn't try to remove himself from the situation. After all, it was a hard-fought victory, one that had been a long time coming. He ended up dragging Smith's bloody corpse up and down the cell block, showing off his trophy to his fellow prisoners and hallowing about how he just slaughtered the DC Blacks' longtime leader. The murder ended up with Silverstein receiving yet another life sentence, and this time, it was without the possibility of parole. By 1983, Silverstein had firmly established his reputation as one of the worst prisoners in the entire country. He hated the correctional officers, and they hated him in turn. But one officer in particular despised Silverstein with a passion and dedicated a great deal of his time to making his life torture.
Blood or gold.
Some say that correctional officer Merle Klutz deliberately harassed Silverstein for almost a year, doing anything and everything he could to make his life harder than it had to be. In one instance, Klutz was said to have entered Silverstein's cell while he was painting, Silverstein's only creative outlet, and one he seemed to treasure beyond words. After making a few derisive comments on his artistic skills, Klutz apparently took down a few of Silverstein's paintings and tore them up right there in front of him. Silverstein was apoplectic with rage, yet he had no recourse whatsoever. If he killed a prison guard, he would surely get the death penalty, and although Silverstein feared very little in life, he feared death. Yet as the harassment continued, day after day, week after week, Silverstein found that he had less and less to lose. If Klutz was determined to take everything away from him, then he'd find a way to take everything from Klutz in turn. Then, on October 22nd of 1983, Klutz let Silverstein out of his cell to take a shower. As they walked, Silverstein began limping and complained to Klutz that he was in serious pain. Klutz harbored no sympathy and kept on walking, telling Silverstein that he had a set amount of time to wash and would not be waited for. Yet as Klutz passed Silverstein in the hallway, he fell into a carefully planned trap of the murderer's creation. Silverstein stopped outside the cell of another inmate, who unlocked his handcuffs with a homemade key and handed him a prison shank, all in one fluid motion. Silverstein then kept his hands firmly behind his back as he continued to limp towards an ever-impatient Klutz. Then in one fell swoop, he pounced. Klutz was stabbed so many times that he was dead before his fellow correctional officers could even restrain his attacker. Then minutes later, the entirety of Marion Penitentiary was placed on an indefinite lockdown, which ultimately lasted for 23 years. Klutz's murder had sent shockwaves through the prison staff community, and tens of thousands of them wrote letters to the Department of Corrections demanding safer working conditions for themselves and their colleagues. As a result, a brand new kind of federal prison was designed, one that would be christened Super Maximum Security. The first of its kind was Florence Penitentiary in Colorado, and one of the first inmates transferred there was none other than the prisoner who inspired its design, Thomas Silverstein. Following Klutz's murder and prior to his transfer to Florence Supermax Prison, Silverstein was transferred to a United States penitentiary in Atlanta, where he was placed in complete solitary confinement. A note on his file specified that he was to have no human contact due to the danger he presented to the correctional officers. Silverstein later claimed that this no human contact status was basically a form of legalized torture reserved for those who had killed correctional officers. This prompted a Bureau of Prisons official to publicly state that when an inmate kills a guard, he must be punished. We can't execute Silverstein, so we have no choice but to make his life torture. Otherwise, other inmates will kill guards too. There has to be some supreme punishment. Every convict knows what Silverstein is going through. We want them to realize that if they cross the line that he did, they will pay a heavy price. If this story hasn't quite made it clear how completely evil Thomas Silverstein was, let this last anecdote put it beyond all doubt. During the 1987 Atlanta prison riots, Cuban prisoners released Silverstein from his isolation cell as a method of terrifying the correctional officer hostages they'd taken. As a result, Thomas was able to roam freely about the prison and threatened to execute the Cubans' hostages on a number of separate occasions. When they refused him access to them, Silverstein threatened to kill them too and hurled racial abuse at the Cubans until they turned on him and took him as a hostage too. As a show of good faith, the Cubans then handed Silverstein over to the FBI's hostage rescue team, who considered Silverstein's recapture as a landmark moment in the quelling of the disturbance. Just consider how abhorrent an inmate has to be for their fellow prisoners to attack them, tie them up, and hand them over to the federal government during a prison riot. When that type of contempt is comprehended, then you have an idea of how other hardened criminals felt about Thomas Silverstein, who was without a shadow of a doubt one of the most vicious and violent prisoners in United States history. In the end, Silverstein's life would end as the result of a sharp implement, just not in the same way you might expect. He died on May 11th of 2019 at St. Anthony's Hospital in Lakewood, Colorado after suffering complications following heart surgery. He spent an incredible 36 years in solitary confinement, but shockingly, that's not even the record for the longest a U.S. prisoner has spent in such conditions. There are plenty of debates over who served the longest in solitary confinement, and many of these arguments hinge on whether the confinement was cumulative or concurrent. But one thing is clear: Thomas Silverstein deserved every moment he spent deprived of human contact. Those who relinquish their humanity deserve nothing less.
Minions have spawned.
If I asked you to list the most bloodthirsty British criminals of all time, whose names would you give me? Perhaps you'd say Ian Brady, Dennis Nilsen, Fred West, or even Victorian London's own Jack the Ripper. There are most definitely other names which belong on that list, but one that seems to be continuously neglected, unknown to even the most ardent true crime aficionados, is that of Robert John Maudsley.
Loyalty is an art.
Robert was born on June 26 of 1953 into a family of 14 in the English city of Liverpool. Due to the immense number of siblings he had, Robert's parents were almost completely incapable of feeding and clothing him due to crushing financial constraints. This led to him being placed in a Catholic orphanage in the nearby village of Crosby, as local authorities quickly established that not only was Robert being maltreated in his parents' care, but he was also being abused by his father and older siblings. Around the time of Robert's 8th birthday, his father approached the orphanage with proof that he was financially capable of caring for the boy. He had recently been promoted at work, and the additional income made him eligible to apply for custody. A short time later, the orphanage returned Robert to the care of his family, but this only meant that the disgusting abuse could resume, and this time, it was far worse than it had been previously. The abuse soon came to the attention of Liverpool's Department of Social Services, who intervened on Robert's behalf and once again removed him from his parents' care. Maudsley would later state that this constant instability, coupled with incessant abuse at the hands of his own parents, would leave him with deep psychological scars. Robert escaped Liverpool as soon as he could and moved down to London in the late 1960s. But work was not easy to come by, and even when he could find work, his behavioral problems meant his employment rarely lasted long. Robert's lack of employability was also exacerbated by his increasing reliance on hard drugs, which he used to stave off a deep and debilitating depression. It wasn't long before Robert turned to illicit means in order to support his habit. He became a male escort, frequenting London's Soho district, where he propositioned those who visited the areas at many of the gay bars. Given his heterosexuality, this took a heavy toll on Robert's already failing mental health, and after several botched attempts at his own life, he was forced to seek psychiatric help. In one lengthy chat with a London-based psychiatrist,
Robert confessed to hearing voices in his head, some of which implored him to murder his own parents. Naturally, the doctor talked him out of such a hideous act of violence, but it seems that Robert's thirst for a bloody revenge against a society that had continually mistreated him continued to fester within. In 1974, Robert was still selling himself in and around London when he was propositioned by a man named John Farrell. They arranged to meet in the suburb of Wood Green, and after picking Robert up in his car and driving him to a secluded area, John began to show him a series of photographs depicting distressed young children. When Robert asked him what the purpose of this was, John Farrell replied that they were all children that he had abused at some point in the past, and that he carried photographs of them as grim trophies of his exploits. Himself a victim of abuse, Robert Maudsley flew into a murderous rage at this revelation and strangled Farrell right there in his own car. Following the murder, Robert handed himself in to the local police, confessing to the murder and pleading for psychiatric care. It was later determined that, due to his past traumas and shattered psyche, Robert was completely unfit to stand trial and was therefore sent to Broadmoor High-Security Psychiatric Hospital in the English County of Berkshire. You may be forgiven for thinking that Robert was genuinely remorseful over the murder he committed.
You can't
After
take
all,
the desert.
he did hand himself in over to the police. Yet the reality was that the murder had provided Robert with a deep satisfaction. It was the revenge he'd been craving for years by that point, and afterwards, he only wanted more. In 1977, Robert discovered that he was sharing one of Broadmoor's wings with a convicted child abuser by the name of David Francis. He then spent around 2 or 3 weeks befriending Francis, sharing cigarettes and sweets with the man until his trust was earned. Then, after luring Francis into a cell, Robert attacked him, and after restraining him with a length of torn bedsheet, Robert proceeded to torture Francis to death over the course of 9 long hours. Incredibly, Robert managed to completely avoid an outright murder charge, citing his past abuse at the hands of his siblings and parents. Instead, he was convicted of manslaughter, but with a special addendum stating that he would never be released from prison. This was probably on account of the fact that Robert was completely remorseless when faced with the charge, and stated that he would kill any and all abusers of children that he encountered either in prison or on the outside. It seems this claim, while perversely righteous, was not strictly true, as by that point, Robert's thirst for blood extended well beyond those he perceived as abusers. In 1978, Robert took the lives of 2 of his fellow prisoners in the space of just a few hours. His first victim was Solney Darwood, a man convicted of murdering his wife. And just like with David Francis, Robert lured the man into his cell under the false pretense of sharing luxury goods with him. Once the pair were alone, Robert garroted Darwood with a piece of wire, stabbing him to death while unconscious, then attempted to hide the bloody, mutilated corpse under his bed. Robert then attempted to lure a second prisoner into his cell, but not a single other person walked into his trap. His bloodlust was so great that he was no longer content to simply bait another prisoner into his room, and he began prowling the wing for more victims. Most knew to stay well enough away from Robert, whose reputation often preceded him. But one William Robert wasn't nearly savvy enough to keep out of his way. And when Robert cornered William in the wing's recreation room, the only solace came in a quick and relatively painless death. But Robert didn't just cut William's throat and leave him to bleed out on the floor, as once he was dead, a shockingly perverse act of mutilation began. Robert began smashing William's lifeless head into a nearby wall, so many times that it cracked the man's skull wide open. It's then thought that Robert began using a makeshift knife to scoop out some of his victims' brains from his fleshy open skull before eating them raw. Robert then calmly walked into the wing's office, placed the bloody dagger on the table of the attending correctional officer, and then told them that he had shortened the prisoner's roll call by 2. Despite the press circulating that Robert had eaten a part of William Robert's brain, the British Press Complaints Commission cited the dead man's autopsy and claimed that this simply wasn't true.
However, it's important to note this was essentially just cover to prevent further public outcry. Not only did the autopsy reveal that the victim's skull was in such a terrible state that it was impossible to determine if the brain-eating element was true, but at least 3 other inmates claimed that they had personally witnessed Robert eating his victim's brains, and stated as such to the prison's warden in an attempt to keep Robert segregated from the rest of the prisoner population. Not long after the brain-eating incident, Robert was deemed too dangerous for a regular prison cell. So, in order to keep the rest of the prison population safe from him, a specialized cell was constructed in the basement of Wakefield Prison, and whenever he was outside of it, it was never to be escorted by any less than 4 prison officers. To keep him placated, his cell is almost double the size of a regular one, but instead of steel or concrete walls, his cell is constructed almost entirely of bulletproof glass, so that his behavior can be observed at all times. The only furnishings are a table and chair, and both are made of compressed cardboard. This is because Robert has repeatedly attempted to take his own life, and anything that he could possibly use to hang himself or open a vein is strictly prohibited from being in his cell. In light of that, a solid steel door opens into a small cage within the cell, encased in thick, transparent acrylic panels, with a small slot at the bottom through which officers pass him food and other items. The toilet and wash basin are bolted to the floor, while his bed is nothing but a concrete slab. Robert remains confined to this cell for 23 hours a day and is not allowed contact with any other inmates. Then, during his daily hour of exercise, he is escorted to the yard by 6 prison officers, each ready to restrain him if he suddenly attempts to take his own life in some way. In March of the year 2000, Robert begged prison staff for the terms of his solitary confinement be relaxed, but thankfully for his fellow prisoners, his request was denied. He then asked for permission to take his own life via a cyanide capsule, and again, this was denied. In a last gasp to maintain what was little left of his sanity, he asked for a pet parakeet, but prison officials were so suspicious that he might eat the poor thing alive that this request was also denied. Prisoners like Robert remind us of the quote from Richard Lee McNair, the one where he mentions prisons being a blessing on society. The idea that Robert could be free to walk among us, a man said to have eaten another's raw brains, is far more terrifying than any movie monster or campfire ghost story. Because Robert is real, and he is very, very dangerous. Me and a few mates decided on a little lad's holiday to Malaysia. We packed up some things, booked some flights to Kuala Lumpur, and set off on what we thought was going to be the adventure of a lifetime. We only wanted to stay for a week, do some drinking, see some sights, chat to some girls. It was supposed to be a dream holiday for us, but for me personally it ended up being an absolute nightmare. I haven't really got a bad word to say about Malaysia. I want to make that clear, and everyone but a handful of Malays I met were great folks. And despite it actually being me who's one of the idiots in this story, I'm not evil, but I definitely shared a space with some people who were. So, like I said, there's a big chance you're not going to have any sympathy for me here, because I'm one of the villains of the story. Not nearly as much as a villain as some others, but a villain nonetheless. You see, I got flirting with this Malay girl who turned out to have a boyfriend. And when the boyfriend started giving it the big one, I gave him a slap that would have impressed Will Smith. Wink, wink. He hits me back. I throw him over a table, and before my mates got involved and dragged me off the bloke, I got a few decent hits in on him. I was drunk as a skunk at the time, and I've had plenty of fisticuffs back in Oz with people just going their separate ways after a bit of a scuffle. And then the next thing I know, as we're leaving the bar, the Malaysian cops show up
and practically everyone spills out of the bar to be like, him, he was the one fighting, arrest him. And believe me, arrest me they did. I won't go through the ins and outs of the court case, but let's just say that I didn't have a leg to stand on.
I won't.
The whole thing was caught on CCTV, and as much as my lawyer and the bloke from the Aussie consulate tried to barter my sentence down to deportation, I ended up getting 4 months in Kajang prison. I cried like a baby that
Your
first night
team
on the
has
man,
destroyed a
as I'd
turret.
gotten into my head that Kajang would be some kind of torture that I'd never make it out alive from. But honestly, I think it was a bit of prejudice speaking, because the prison itself didn't turn out to be all that bad. Yeah, it was grim, but if you kept your head down, behaved yourself, and didn't have sticky fingers, you got along quite well. But if you didn't behave, if you stole from your fellow prisoners and made their lives difficult, they made your life difficult in turn. And that's a lesson that a Nigerian bloke learned 100 times over. I was probably just as surprised as you are to find out that there was a little Nigerian contingent in a Malay prison. But so there was. All these big scary looking blokes too. You couldn't have wanted to be facing them in a scrum, not even on your best day. But from what I came to understand, they were having trouble with one of their own, and this one turned out to be a much smaller one who had a habit of going on the take. He'd steal from everyone. The Malays, the Indos in the kitchen, even his own Nigerian brothers, and in the end, some Malay gangsters got right bloody sick of it and decided to teach him a lesson. They just didn't do it somewhere private either, shanking him in the showers or however they'd like to do it in America. The Malay Mafia did it at a time and place where everyone would be able to see what happens to thieves, and they did it in a way that meant no one could touch them for it. I remember the sound of it like it was yesterday. We're all in the canteen, and I was part of the second sitting, meaning the second group of prisoners that were allowed into the canteen to eat. And then out of nowhere, I hear the single most blood-curdling scream that's ever graced my ears. The only thing I can compare it to was when Andy Durrell broke his femur playing footy in grade 9. It was like a bloody great wail that came from the kitchens in the back, one that rose up in pitch and intensity until everyone in the
I've got
canteen was
value.
grimacing just from the sound of
Stack up
it.
nicely.
It had that real nails on a chalkboard effect to it, like it made me want to plug my ears just to keep from hearing it. It just didn't stop either. The screams kept going on and on, like whatever was going on back in the kitchen, someone was in a lot of pain.
Rampage.
The screws basically ran back into the kitchen to see what was going on, and everyone was looking over to the kitchen entrance, and that was at the side of the serving counter, wanting to know just what had made someone scream like that. A few seconds later, they lead the thieving Nigerian bloke out, who was holding his arms out in front of them. And Jesus Christ, I've never seen burns so bad on anyone or anything. Up to about the middle of his forearms, all of his skin was blistered and peeling, like it literally looked deep fried. And the whole time he was being let out of the canteen, he was letting out this horrible mixture of screams and wails, like he was literally crying like a baby shouting, "Look what they did to me! Look what they did to me!" He was quickly followed by the head of the kitchen team, who ironically was the least supervised crew in the whole prison. You'd think that they'd have more supervision considering they had access to knives and pans and all that. But no, it was one of the cushiest jobs for that exact reason. The kitchen team were also made up of almost entirely Malay Mafia guys, mainly because they could organize things to be smuggled into the prison in the food deliveries they received. So, the bloke that headed up the kitchen team, he was pretty high up in the Malay Mafia hierarchy from what I understand. And it was him that came out of the kitchen with a big smile on his face, saying something in Malay to one of the guards. I turned to the bloke next to me and asked what was being said, and was told the guy was saying he had an accident, boss. He slipped on some oil. But as any of you can probably guess, the guy hadn't slipped at all. I later heard, and I don't know how true this is, that they invited him into the kitchen so he could get some extra food. And he promised to stop stealing stuff if he could get some
Wealth
extras.
is my kind of
And little did he know, the
An
Nigerian
enemy
guys
has
had basically okayed him getting punished from the Malays, probably just to keep them sweet since they had a little smuggling arrangement with them. Then, after getting the guy into the kitchen with the promise of extra food,
They braced
Laws or
him,
whatever
dragged him
works
over
at
to the
the
deep
time.
fat fryer, then forced his arms into it while it was turned up high. Everyone else in the kitchen then swore blind that the whole thing had been an accident, and that they had no idea what the guy was talking about when he said that he'd had his arms forced into the fryer. They had said that he'd slipped on some oil that had leaked out of the unit or something, and the guards just ate it up. That was without a doubt the most terrifying thing I'd ever witnessed or heard about when I was inside, and nothing else even compared to it. I sometimes still have nightmares where I can hear that guy screaming, and at one point, I even had a nightmare where it was me having my arms forced into the fryer. In a dream, when I pulled my arms out of the thing, they looked like fried chicken, but all bloodied and melting too, if you can picture it. Even had the nightmares after I got out when my 4-month stretch was finally over. I think it's because since I was just waiting for something bad to happen the whole time, when it finally did and I saw it, I couldn't help but be like obsessive over it, if that makes sense. And getting back to Australia was just a dream, and the reunion with my parents was an emotional one, but intense affair. Mom said that she didn't know whether to smack me or hug me, but Dad later said that he knew boys would be boys, and that as much as I deserved to be kicked out with a lifetime ban or a fine or something, making an example out of me wasn't fair in the least bit. But anyway, lesson
You
learned.
can't.
And don't mess around in other countries, kids, because they don't mess around either.
Has been slain. You have been slain.
Ever see the old HBO show Oz? To this day, it's my favorite TV show ever, and back in my late teens and early 20s, it was solely responsible for me wanting to work as a correctional officer. It might sound a little dumb to you because it definitely sounds dumb when I think about it these days, but I figure those guys were like the toughest SOBs on the face of the earth. They dealt with the worst of the worst every single day of their lives, mad-dogging serial murderers just to keep them in line, literally going one-on-one with some absolute monsters sometimes, and being tough enough to come out on top. To me, they seem like the special forces of the law enforcement world. Not out there helping old ladies cross the street or chasing down kids on stolen bikes, but keeping the likes of El Chapo or Charlie Manson locked up and away from the civilized world. I mean, that's as noble a profession as ever there was one, right? And I still think the same thing today to an extent.
Get out.
But there was a lot about being a CEO that I didn't figure until I was actually doing the job. And let me tell you,
Your team
it's never
has
the drug
destroyed
traffickers or
turrets.
serial killers that actually keep you up at night. It's guys like the one I have to tell you about in my story here.
I've got
So,
value.
this one night,
They stack up
way
nicely.
back when I was still going through my on-the-job training, I had to go pull a shift in the medical ward. But I have to make something clear here. The medical ward is not the hospital, and a better name for it would be the psych unit or mental health unit or something. Because it's the place we kept the guys who weren't mentally well enough to be around other regular prisoners. Each inmate had their own isolated cell, and were only let out twice a day to eat and to exercise, and never around the general population. That night I was shadowing the unit's nurse while she was doing her rounds, which mostly involved doing welfare checks and giving out the appropriate medicines to all the various prisoners. Then, we get this one prisoner's cell, and the second I unlocked the door and opened it, I was almost knocked out onto my butt by the most stomach-turning smell I'd ever smelled in my life. Like, I knew at the time it was fecal matter, but there's a huge difference between a fresh dump and the kind of stuff that had been plastered in this guy's butt for maybe 2 or 3 days at that point. The nurse knew better than to go in without protection, too. She told me after that she always dabbed a little Vaseline in her nostrils before making the rounds. That way she couldn't smell a thing. Anyway, once we were done handing out the medicine, I walked right up to my training officer and asked him what the deal was with the prisoner who smelled like a sewage drain. I expected him to just burst out laughing at me, which had so far been his textbook response for almost every dumb or ignorant question that had come out of my mouth. To the older guys, it was fun for them to see a youngster all horrified over all the stuff they'd dealt with for years. But then it came to the human sewage pipe. For some reason, it was nothing to laugh
Isn't
at.
my kind of burden.
My trainer just kind of sighed, spun around in his chair and said something like, "So, you finally met Marshall then, huh?" He then explained that smelling bad was kind of his thing, and that as much as the medical team had tried to coach him out of it, he seemed to despise being clean. Whenever they did manage to talk him into showering or whatever, he acted like he was on the verge of a panic attack until he finally got a chance to soil himself again. And then I made the mistake of asking why he always went to the bathroom on himself. My trainer explained that in the prison that he was held in before the one I worked at, he was repeatedly attacked and, how do I put this, violated by other prisoners. Like repeatedly targeted in the showers until he finally found a novel way of keeping his attackers off him. If he made himself a walking biohazard, the people who were targeting him suddenly weren't so keen on attacking him anymore. I guess he lived like that for so long in the safety of his own filth that it took on like a comforting psychological effect for him. I remember saying something like, "Poor guy, no wonder he's so screwed up." My trainer almost spat his coffee out before telling me I wouldn't have any sympathy for the guy if I knew what his conviction was. Turned out, he was a serial child abuser. And that was the reason he'd had a target painted on his back in the first place. He was right. I didn't have any sympathy for him after that. And it made it all the creepier that he'd like to use little kids' language whenever he spoke to any of the staff or COs. Like instead of saying that he, soiled himself or whatever, he would say things like, "I went potty on myself." Like if the guy had straight up learning difficulties or whatever, I'd maybe understand, but the CEO said Marshall was way more devious and evil than he'd like to make out. He was a master manipulator and a complete psychopath who didn't care about anyone but himself. Worst job in the whole prison was undoubtedly the cleaners who had to hose down Marshall's room every few days. The first year I was there, we had 6 different cleaners just refuse to do the job, even when they were offered what amounted to chemical warfare suits to get the job done safely. All 6 then quit when they were told that they had to do it or face getting fired. And that was 6 in the first year alone, and by this point I've literally lost count of the numbers of cleaners who've quit because of Marshall and his unique self-defense techniques. Those are the kind of prisoners they never tell you about during the recruitment phase. And when you see them in the movies or TV shows, plenty of psycho prisoners on Oz, for example, you always just think it's some kind of dumb Hollywood exaggeration to make the drama more intense or something. But sometimes you meet a prisoner that could be the star of their own horror movie. And to me and most of the other COs too, Marshall was that prisoner.
Get paid and get out.
I spent a few years inside on drug-related charges when I was younger.
They stack up
And let me tell you, prison is no joke. By the time I got out, I was all kinds of messed up, and I'm pretty sure I still got some kind of PTSD from some of the scary stuff that I saw. Saw a lot of violence, a lot of guys just being straight up evil to lesser, weaker dudes. But I think the thing that got me the most was how pointless and senseless a lot of it was. This one time I was playing cards with some guys and one of them was smoking a cigarette. This other dude, who wasn't playing with us, comes up to the table and asks the guy for shorts on it. Shorts means before you finish your cig, you can hand it off to someone else and they can get the last few drags on it before there's none left. The smoker agrees, but barely even looks up from the game. Then the other guy thanks him and then walks off. I think the smoker was just way too lost in the game, and he figured the guy would be watching and then would come back once the cig was almost out. So he just carried on with his game. Then, when the cig was finished, he just flicked it and carried on playing. Stuff like that starts fights for sure, and I remember thinking like, uh-oh,
That guy ain't gonna be happy. And lo and behold, minutes later, the guy comes back. Sees the smoker isn't smoking anymore, and just asks him real cool, like, he didn't save me no shorts? Again, the guy barely even looks up and just says, I'm sorry. Then carries on putting down and picking up cards after telling him we should come back for the next one. The guy seemed kind of angry, but he just nods like, alright, and then walks off like he's going to look for another guy to call shorts on, as I said. About a half hour goes by, and then the smoker takes his pack out, pulls another cig, and then lights up. I look up in time to see the same shorts guy walking over, figuring he's about to ask for shorts again. Only, when he gets behind the smoker, he doesn't ask him anything. He just grabs the guy by the chin, pulls his head back, and starts shanking him in the throat with what I figured was a pen or pencil that he'd somehow managed to sharpen. We only get blunt stuff to write with, go figure, but somehow this guy must have been sharpening it against something. God knows what, because he was shanking this guy over and over and over again, that blood was just bubbling out all down his neck and onto his shirt. Obviously, we all jumped up while people are calling out for the COs, and then a bunch of them in riot gear showed up and just unleashed the works on him. Pepper spray, tasers, batons. I mean, they beat the life out of this guy even after he just got on his knees and surrendered. The medics got to the guy who had been shanked way after he needed them. They can't come into an area like that until all the threats have been dealt with. So, honestly, I think the guy bled out before they even got to him, because we heard a few days later that he'd been taken to the morgue almost straight from the prison hospital. And stuff like that, all combined for my years there, ended up just making me really tense all the time. Constant anxiety. And for a long time, any kind of sharp object had me panicking that someone was going to use it on me. I knew they weren't, but it's just my brain was just in war mode all the time, ready to fight or flight, even though I knew I was safely out of lockup. I guess that's what I mean about prison being no joke. You don't ever really get out, not unless you're one of those psychos who lives for that kind of lifestyle. I knew of a few guys inside who were just like that, just doing dumb, petty stuff from the outside just to get back into lockup with their homies. They said they never meant to get caught, but then they used to roll around gangbanging, just not caring, and then acted all happy when they got back inside with their respective gang. People were crazy, man. Like, seriously crazy, and since I got out, I decided that lifestyle just wasn't for me. My job sucks now. I legit work at an Amazon center right now, and it's incredibly boring and tedious. But man, it pays the bills. And working with boring civilians is something that never makes me feel like I'm in danger, really ever. Danger of getting fired sometimes, sure, but at least I can sleep at night not having to worry about getting shanked. My brother spent some time in the county a few years back and said it was the worst time of his life. I asked him what the worst thing that happened to him was, and he said he didn't want to talk about it, but he did tell me this one story that just might be one of the most messed up things I've ever heard. The thing that gets me about it is that it actually starts off kind of funny. I mean, not for the dude it's about, but you'll see what I mean. Then it goes from something you tell as a funny story to something you tell as a straight-up horror story. Hence why I'm sending this in. It goes from 0 to 100 in just seconds, and I get why he would be shook up about seeing it. So my brother said that a few months into his stretch, the guy across from him has this new cellie move in with him. The guy seemed cool at first.